I forgot to tell my wife I had fixed the hidden camera in the living room when I sat down in the dark to review the footage, expecting maybe to catch our housekeeper slipping out early. I saw my wife of 45 years clutching a small glass vial. Her son-in-law drew close and murmured 3 drops in his coffee each morning. It mimics Alzheimer's perfectly. Everything that followed turned my world upside down. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you found your way here. Before we go any further, drop a quick comment and let me know, is this your first time sitting down with one of these stories, or have you been riding along with me for a while? I'd genuinely love to know. Now, a brief note, some elements of this story have been shaped for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real persons or events is purely coincidental. What carries the truth is the message at the heart of it. The sprawling home we owned in the wealthy suburbs of Houston sat completely still. The only light in my dark office came from the cold blue glow of the laptop screen. I had spent 35 years as a fraud investigator for the IRS, a career built on chasing paper trails, reading between the lines, and catching people in their most elaborate deceptions. But nothing, not one moment of that career, could have readied me for the lie that had been sitting in my own living room. A few days before the security camera tucked inside the bookshelf had quit on me, I am the kind of man who keeps his hands busy, so I opened it up, swapped out a faulty wire, and got it running again. I simply forgot to mention it to my wife, Paulette. I was only scrolling through the recorded footage to confirm the motion sensor was calibrated correctly. Then I saw them. Paulette, the woman I had shared my life with for 45 years, was seated on the expensive leather sofa. Across from her sat Gavin. Gavin is a 38-year-old white real estate developer who married our daughter Alicia 5 years ago. He always moved through rooms with a slick, unearned confidence, custom-tailored suits. Cars constantly traded in for newer models. I never cared for him, but I held my tongue for Alicia's sake. On the screen, the living room was washed in dim light. The timestamp told me it had been the previous afternoon, right around the time I usually settle in for my daily nap. Gavin reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and drew out a small, dark glass vial. He set it on the coffee table and slid it slowly toward my wife. I cranked the volume all the way up and pressed my headphones hard against my ears. Gavin leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, calculated whisper. He told her to put 3 drops into my coffee every morning. He said his doctor confirmed it, mimics the symptoms of Alzheimer's with perfect accuracy. He said I would grow confused. I would lose my footing mid-thought, and my hands would begin to shake. Paulette stared at the vial. She did not look horrified. She did not raise her hand at him. She did not throw him out of the house I had built with my own labor. Instead, she picked it up and turned it over in her fingers, studying it. We need him incapacitated by the end of the month. Gavin continued his tone, sharpening edged with urgency. Once the doctor signs off on his mental decline, we can activate the power of attorney. We need that land, Paulette. If we don't get control of his assets soon, the whole thing falls apart. Paulette nodded slowly. Her face was a blank wall, not a flicker of feeling. She slipped the vial into the pocket of her designer cardigan. She told him she would take care of it. She told him to make sure the paperwork was airtight because she wanted no legal complications when the moment arrived. I froze. The blood in my veins went cold as ice water. I pressed pause. The frozen image of my wife, the woman who had kissed my cheek that very morning, stayed locked on the screen, a willing partner in my own poisoning. 45 years. We had built this life side by side. We marched for civil rights in our youth. We weathered recessions together. To watch her trade all of that shared history for whatever Gavin had promised her was a betrayal so deep it registered in my bones. Over the past 2 weeks, I had been suffering through strange symptoms. My thoughts had felt wrapped in fog. I was losing the thread of sentences before I finished them. But the most troubling thing was my hands. They had begun to tremble, a fine, steady tremor that made holding a fork or working a shirt button a maddening ordeal. Paulette had been performing the role of the worried, devoted wife without missing a step. She had held my shaking hands with eyes full of manufactured sympathy, gently suggesting we see a neurologist. She told me it was just my age catching up. 70 is not the new 50, sweetheart, she had said, rubbing my back. We have to face reality. But the reality was right there, glowing on my laptop screen. It was not age. It was not a degenerative disease. It was poison. I understood immediately and completely why Gavin was doing this. I own a prime commercial real estate parcel in downtown Houston. I picked it up for almost nothing back in the 80s when nobody wanted it. Today developers would bleed for it. They call it the legacy block. It is worth tens of millions of dollars. Gavin has been eyeing my property since the day he married Alicia. He has brought me dozens of joint venture proposals, and I turned down every single one because his business model is built on smoke and mirrors. Now, his desperation made perfect sense. If I would not hand it over willingly, he intended to take it by force by convincing the world my mind had gone dark. I looked down at my desk. Right beside the mouse pad sat the porcelain mug I had used for my morning coffee. I always leave a little in the bottom. I raised my hands slowly and held them out before me. They were trembling just slightly. For 14 days I had been drinking my own undoing served to me with a warm smile by the woman who slept beside me every night. A deep, suffocating quiet closed in around me. A lesser man might have screamed. A lesser man might have charged into the bedroom, shaken his wife awake, and demanded the truth. Part of me burned to do exactly that. Every fiber wanted to kick the door down and face her. But I did not survive decades at the IRS by letting my temper run the show. I survived by building airtight cases. They thought they were dealing with a senile old man whose mind was turning to mush. They had forgotten who I was. They had forgotten that before I was a wealthy retiree, I was the man who dismantled million-dollar financial empires with nothing but a calculator and a sharp eye for deceit. I extended my trembling fingers, steadying them just enough to pull a small plastic Ziploc bag from the desk drawer. I carefully poured the remaining few drops of cold, dark coffee from the mug into the bag and sealed it shut. Tomorrow I was going to visit an old friend who ran a private toxicology lab. Paulette and Gavin wanted to play in the shadows. They wanted to strip away my mind and my legacy, but in doing so, they had just handed the rulebook to a master. I closed the laptop. The blue light disappeared and the office went pitch black. The tremor in my hands was still there, but my mind had never been sharper. They wanted a war over my wealth. They were about to receive a masterclass in total destruction. The morning sun came through the sheer curtains of our dining room, same as it had for 2 decades in that house. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning in Houston. I sat at the head of the long walnut table in my robe, working through the morning paper. From the kitchen drifted the familiar sounds of my wife preparing breakfast, the clink of porcelain, the low hum of the coffee maker, the gentle melody of a gospel song she always hummed when her spirits were light. For 45 years, those sounds meant warmth. They meant home. But that morning, that sweet gospel hum sounded like the score to my own funeral. I kept my eyes fixed on the newspaper, while every part of my mind was trained on the kitchen. I knew precisely what she was doing in there. I could picture her drawing the small dark vial from her pocket, unscrewing the cap, counting out 3 drops into my black coffee. I wondered what moved through her mind in that moment. Did her hand waver? Did even a splinter of guilt find her? Or was she thinking about the designer dresses and luxury vacations Gavin had dangled before her? Once I was gone, neutralized and locked away in some memory care ward. A few minutes later, Paulette walked into the dining room. She wore a pristine white blouse, her hair flawlessly arranged, looking every bit the loving, devoted matriarch our community believed her to be. She carried a steaming porcelain mug and set it down softly on the coaster beside my newspaper. "Here you go, my love," she said, her voice laced with that smooth southern warmth she had spent years perfecting. "Drink it while it's hot. It'll wake you right up." I looked up from my paper and gave her a tired, easy smile, the kind an aging husband gives the woman looking after him. "Thank you, Paulette," I said quietly, letting my voice come out a touch weaker, a little more worn than usual. She stood there leaning against the back of the empty chair beside me, watching with careful eyes. Normally, she would have returned to the kitchen to fix her own plate, but that morning, she lingered. She wanted to watch me drink it. She needed to be certain the dose went down. The anticipation in her eyes was nearly vibrating. I reached out slowly toward the mug and commanded my hand to shake. Faking the tremor wasn't difficult. Her earlier doses had already done that work for me. My fingers shook violently as they moved toward the mug's handle. I let my hand catch clumsily against the side of the heavy porcelain cup. It tipped at once. Hot dark coffee spread across the polished walnut table and poured down onto the Turkish rug beneath my chair. "Oh no," I stammered, pulling my hands back and staring at the mess with wide, frightened eyes. "I am so sorry, Paulette. My hand just gave out. I don't know what's been happening to me lately." I expected her to do what any loving wife of 45 years would do. I expected her to rush over, grab a napkin, ask whether I'd burn myself, and tell me not to worry about the rug. But the mask slipped. Paulette gasped, her body going rigid, her hands balling into fists at her sides, her face twisting into a look of raw, undisguised fury. "What is wrong with you, Delroy?" She snapped, her voice sharp and vicious, cutting through the quiet dining room. "Look at what you've done. You wasted it. You spilled the whole cup." She wasn't looking at the stained antique table. She wasn't looking at the ruined $1,000 rug. She was fixed on that spreading puddle of coffee as though I had just poured liquid gold onto the floor. Her breathing came hard, the veins in her neck standing out. The panic of a missed dose had shattered her sweet facade completely. "I'm sorry," I whispered, shrinking back into my chair, playing the part of the confused and frightened old man, without missing a beat. "I just can't control the shaking, Paulette. I didn't mean to waste it." She shut her eyes and drew a slow breath, visibly fighting to rein in her temper and remember what role she was supposed to be playing. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, forcing a stiff, unnatural smile onto her face. "It's fine, Delroy. Don't move. I'll clean it up. I'll put on a fresh pot and bring you another cup right now. You need your morning coffee." She turned on her heel and practically ran toward the kitchen for the cleaning supplies, and without question, a fresh cup with a fresh dose. The moment she disappeared around the corner, something shifted in me. The trembling old man fell away, and the retired IRS fraud investigator stepped forward. I looked down at the coffee soaking into the carpet. They had me pegged as a lucky old fool who didn't understand the true worth of what he owned. They were wrong. I am not simply a retired government worker living off a pension. Back in the 1980s, when downtown Houston was struggling and those forgotten neighborhoods couldn't attract $1 of investment, I took every cent I had saved and bought up a vast block of crumbling commercial properties. It took grit. It took fighting banks that had no interest in lending to a black man, and it took decades of patience. Today, that property is known in real estate circles as the Legacy Block. It sits right at the city's core, hemmed in on all sides by billion-dollar developments. It is worth over $30 million, and I own it free and clear. Gavin, my arrogant white son-in-law, had been circling that legacy block since the day he started courting Alicia. He builds those soulless glass mega condos for the ultra-wealthy and has spent years pressing me to sign the land over to his company, dangling a share of the returns from some massive luxury high-rise he was itching to build. But I knew his track record. I knew he was over-leveraged and careless. I told him no every single time. He could not stomach the rejection. To a man like Gavin, a black man from the old neighborhood, holding the most valuable parcel of real estate in the city was an affront to his ego. He needed my land to prop up his failing business, and since I wouldn't hand him the keys, he and my wife had decided to steal my mind to take them. I listened to Paulette rummaging beneath the kitchen sink. I had maybe 30 seconds. I reached into my robe pocket and drew out a small, thick sponge I had placed there earlier, along with a sterile plastic Ziploc bag. I bent down quickly and pressed the sponge hard into the wettest section of the Turkish rug, letting it pull up the dark poison coffee. I dropped the saturated sponge into the Ziploc bag, squeezed out the air, sealed it tight, and tucked it back into my deep pocket. By the time Paulette came marching back into the dining room with a roll of paper towels and a spray bottle, I was sitting perfectly still, staring blankly at the wall, every inch the lost old man. "Here," she muttered, dropping to her knees to scrub the rug, her movements aggressive and impatient. "The new pot is brewing. I'll bring you a fresh cup in a minute. You are not leaving this table until you drink it." "Actually, Paulette," I said, slowly pushing myself up from the chair and leaning heavily on the table for support, "I think I've lost my appetite. My stomach's feeling a little off. I just need to get out of the house for a bit. Some fresh air." She rose quickly, her eyes flashing with alarm. "No, Delroy, you can't go out right now. You're not thinking straight. You need your coffee. You need to sit down." I shuffled past her, paying no attention to her demands. "I'm just going to take a slow drive," I mumbled, lifting my car keys from the hook by the door. "I'll be back in a few hours. Don't worry about me." She called after me, her voice climbing in desperation. But I was already out the door. I got into my car and locked the doors. As I backed out of the driveway, I checked the rearview mirror and saw Paulette standing on the porch, her face contorted with rage, clutching that roll of paper towels. She had missed her window. I did not drive to any park. I did not take a slow, aimless ride. The moment I cleared our neighborhood, my posture straightened, my grip on the wheel firm and steady. I merged onto the highway, headed straight for downtown Houston. I was going to see an old friend, a man named Ruben, who ran a private independent forensic toxicology lab. We had worked side by side back in my IRS years, building financial profiles on drug cartels. If anyone could identify exactly what chemical cocktail Gavin had provided my wife to dismantle my mind, it was him. Paulette and Gavin believed they were playing a game of real estate and inheritance. They thought they could erase me from my own life and claim the empire I had built with my bare hands. But as I slid into the fast lane, feeling the weight of the plastic bag in my pocket, I knew their game was already finished. I was going to let them dig a little deeper, and then I was going to bury them both. I left Ruben at the toxicology lab with his promise to rush the chemical analysis on the coffee sample. That gave me a few hours before the results came back. I could have found a park to clear my head. I could have walked into a police station. Instead, I picked up my phone and called my daughter Alicia. I needed to look her in the face. I needed to know whether the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders was a hostage inside her own marriage, or a willing partner in my destruction. We agreed to meet for lunch at an overpriced bistro in River Oaks, the kind of place where a salad runs $50 and everybody in the room is performing a wealth they don't quite possess. It was exactly Alicia's kind of place. She walked in 20 minutes late, wearing an ivory wool overcoat and carrying a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. She looked beautiful. She looked exactly like her mother. And in that moment, the resemblance sent a cold chill straight through me. She settled into the seat across from me, barely lifting her eyes from her phone as she tossed out a quick, distracted apology about traffic. I looked at her and saw a 35-year-old woman entirely swallowed by the illusion of high society, a lifestyle funded completely by Gavin's house of cards. I ordered a black coffee and kept my hands flat on the table, making sure she could see the faint tremor in my fingers. I let my shoulders sag, allowing the weight of the past 24 hours to show plainly on my face. I told her I needed to talk to her about some things, important things. She finally laid her phone face down on the table, but her eyes were already somewhere else. She asked what it was sighing, like my very presence was an interruption in her packed schedule. I told her I hadn't been feeling like myself lately. I said my memory was slipping, that names were escaping me, and things kept turning up missing around the house. I watched her face carefully, looking for any genuine flicker of alarm, any daughterly instinct to reach across and comfort her aging father. There was nothing. Her eyes made a quick pass at my trembling hands and returned to my face. She looked like she was running a calculation, not grieving. She told me I was getting older, and her voice carried not a trace of warmth. She said that Paulette and I simply had to accept that we could not manage everything on our own anymore. I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat and leaned in. 35 years as an IRS auditor teaches you to read people to know when they're concealing money and when they're concealing guilt. I told her that was precisely why I had asked her here. I said I was sitting down with my attorney the following week to put the final touches on my will. I told her I intended to transfer the legacy block to her entirely and outright. Her eyes came alive at once. Every trace of boredom was gone, replaced by a sharp, hungry gleam. The legacy block, the $30 million crown jewel that Gavin had been desperate to get his hands on. But there is a condition, I said, letting my voice firm up just slightly. I explained I was placing the property inside an ironclad trust. She would be the sole beneficiary, but Gavin would hold zero legal authority over it whatsoever. His name would not appear on the deed. He could not leverage it, develop it, or pledge it as collateral for his company. I told her I wanted the property to stay inside our bloodline, just her. The change that came over her was immediate and unsettling. Alicia went rigid. The hungry excitement in her eyes curdled into sudden defensive anger. She reached for her phone, without a word dropping it off the table, and onto her lap, below my line of sight. I could see the faint motion of her thumbs working frantically beneath the table. She was texting him. She was warning her husband that the old man was trying to shut him out of the gold mine. She turned on me, completely dropping all pretense of being a caring daughter. She demanded to know why I would deliberately cut Gavin out when he was her husband. I kept my face arranged in perfect confusion, playing the part of the paranoid old man. I told her I had concerns about the way he conducted business. I said he built too fast and borrowed too heavily. I reminded her that I had assembled that property block by block, and I wanted to protect what I had built for her sake. She let out a hard, contemptuous laugh that sounded exactly like her mother, Paulette. She told me I wasn't thinking straight. She said I was clearly disoriented and losing my grip on reality. Then she leaned across the table and passionately defended the man who was at that very moment poisoning my breakfast. She called Gavin a financial genius. She said he had a vision for downtown Houston that I simply was not equipped to grasp. She argued that handing him control of the legacy block was the right move for the family's future, that he could multiply its value within a year. She looked me directly in the eyes and said that clinging to my land out of stubborn old-fashioned pride was nothing but dead weight holding them back. Us. She said us. She did not mean me and her mother. She meant herself and Gavin. I sat across from the woman I had raised. I had paid for her education. I had walked her down the aisle. I had given her everything I had. But as I watched her defend with genuine fire a man who was drowning in debt, a man who was actively working to erase my existence, the truth landed on me like a stone. Alicia was not Gavin's victim. She was his shield. She may not have known about the poison in my coffee, but she knew he was after my assets, and she was perfectly at peace with that as long as it kept her in designer coats and luxury cars. She was willing to let her own father be declared mentally incompetent if it meant her husband could finally cash the check. Right as she was winding up for another polished speech about Gavin's real estate brilliance, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I drew it out slowly. A text message from Ruben at the toxicology lab. I opened it, holding my trembling hands just steady enough to read the short clinical lines. The results were back. The message stated that the coffee sample contained high concentrations of haloperidol. Ruben explained that it is a heavy-duty antipsychotic medication ordinarily prescribed for severe schizophrenia and acute delirium. It is not a mild sedative. At those doses, it functions as a chemical lobotomy. He described how it produces severe tremors, memory loss, and cognitive paralysis. Whoever was administering this to me was not trying to calm me down. They were trying to destroy my mind. His last line told me to get out of that house immediately. I stared at the screen for a long moment. The words seared themselves into my eyes. A chemical lobotomy. My wife was poisoning me. My son-in-law had supplied the weapon, and my daughter, the only child I had in this world, was sitting 3 feet away cheerfully smoothing the road for them to take everything I had built. She seemed annoyed that I wasn't deteriorating fast enough. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I looked at Alicia, who was still texting under the table, no doubt reassuring Gavin that she had the confused old man under control. I was entirely alone. The family I had spent a lifetime creating was nothing more than a pack of wolves waiting for me to bleed out. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot that wolves aren't the only dangerous things moving in the dark. I gave my daughter a smile, cold and flat, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes which she was too busy with her phone to notice. I told her softly that maybe she was right. Maybe I am just a confused old man, I said, and maybe Gavin does know what's best for this family. I told her to enjoy her lunch. I walked out of that restaurant into the bright Houston sun. The heartbreak was gone, burned completely away, leaving nothing behind but pure undivided focus. I was officially a man without a family, but I was also a man holding a $30 million loaded gun. And I was about to pull the trigger. I drove away from that River Oaks bistro with a sharpness of mind I hadn't felt in years. My wife was poisoning me, and my daughter was cheerfully handing over the shovel. I did not go back to that house of lies. Instead, I drove to a quiet public library on the south side of town, a neighborhood where no one knew my face and no one would think to look. I needed a secure internet connection and a still corner where I could do what I do best. I made my way past the rows of dusty shelves and found an isolated table near the back. For 35 years at the Internal Revenue Service, I did not carry a firearm. My weapon was a calculator and an unmatched ability to read the stories men try to bury inside tax returns and corporate filings. I tracked down embezzlers, corrupt politicians, and men who believed their expensive suits made them invisible to the law. I spent decades putting arrogant men in prison because they were convinced their money placed them beyond reach. Gavin thought I was nothing but an outdated old black man sitting on a gold mine he was entitled to own. He was about to learn that he had picked a fight with an apex predator. I opened my laptop and connected to the public network. I cracked my knuckles, feeling the faint, persistent tremor from the haloperidol coursing through my veins. But I pushed past it. My body was under chemical assault, but the mind directing those hands was razor sharp. I began pulling public records on Gavin and his company, Vanguard Real Estate Solutions. On the surface, Gavin projected the perfect image of a modern visionary. His social media was packed with photographs of him, in custom-tailored suits, posed in front of glass high-rises champagne, flute in hand, beside city officials and grinning investors. He spoke at length about transforming the Houston skyline and delivering generational wealth to his partners. My wife Paulette, driven by her deep hunger to belong to high society, had swallowed his illusion whole. She looked at Gavin and saw the country club existence she had always felt was owed to her. But numbers carry no ego. Numbers don't wear Armani suits or drive imported sports cars. Numbers tell only the cold, hard truth. I dug deep into the public land registry's state business databases and uniform commercial code filings. I tracked the limited liability companies he had created for each of his development projects. Separating liabilities is standard practice in commercial real estate, but Gavin had constructed a labyrinth of shell companies that practically announced financial desperation to anyone who knew how to read them. It took 3 solid hours of relentless auditing to untangle his web. I called in a significant favor from a trusted former colleague still working at the federal building, asking him to run a quick background query on several private equity groups tied to Gavin. When the data came back, the picture the spreadsheets assembled was nothing short of catastrophic. Gavin was not a real estate genius. He was a complete fraud. His entire empire rested on a brittle foundation of sand and broken promises. I traced the money moving between his various shell companies. When funding for his new luxury condo project on Main Street dried up, he secretly redirected investor capital from a separate unfinished townhouse development to plug the gap. When the townhouse investors started demanding their returns, he took out enormous high-interest loans from predatory private equity firms to quiet them. He was simply shifting money from one sinking vessel to another. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme, and the music was finally about to stop. I totaled the outstanding liabilities across all his active projects and set them against his actual liquid assets. The final figure stared back at me from the laptop screen like a red warning beacon in the dark. $25 million. Gavin was $25 million in the red. His creditors were not gentle traditional banks that would foreclose on a property and quietly write off the loss. He owed millions to aggressive shadow lenders and unregulated equity firms, the kind of people who don't simply damage your credit. They dismantle your entire existence and take everything you've ever touched. He was going under, and the water was rising fast. If he didn't secure a massive capital injection, within 30 days, his entire corporate structure would collapse. He would face federal indictments for wire fraud, embezzlement, and investor deception. He was staring down the barrel of a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Suddenly, the dark glass vial of poison made terrifying, perfect sense. This was never about ordinary corporate greed. It was about pure animal desperation. My property, the Legacy Block, was valued at over $30 million, and I held it free and clear without a single cent of debt against it. To a man drowning beneath $25 million in toxic loans, my land was the ultimate life preserver. If he could somehow use the Legacy Block as collateral, he could secure an institutional loan large enough to pay off the shadow lenders and keep his Ponzi scheme breathing for a few more years. But as long as I remained of sound mind, he would never touch that deed. I had turned him away too many times. He needed me declared mentally incompetent so that my wife Paulette could assume full legal control through a medical power of attorney. Paulette, blinded by his charm and her own hunger for status, would gladly sign the property over to her sophisticated son-in-law, convinced she was making a brilliant investment. They were proposing to trade my sanity for his salvation. I leaned back in the hard wooden library chair and let the sheer scale of his failure settle over me. Gavin was pathetic. But as I kept scrolling through the property records searching for any other assets he might be concealing, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run completely cold. I pulled up the deed and financial history of the sprawling suburban mansion where Gavin and my daughter Alicia lived. When they purchased that house 5 years ago, Gavin boasted to our entire family that he had paid cash. He threw a lavish housewarming party and framed it as proof of his unstoppable success. Alicia had paraded her friends through the marble halls as though she had married the King of Houston. But the public registry told an entirely different story. Gavin had not paid in cash. He had taken out a large primary mortgage on the property, but that was not the worst of it. Reviewing the recent financial filings, I discovered that over the past 8 months, as his Ponzi scheme began rapidly unraveling, Gavin had quietly taken out a second and then a third mortgage against the house. He had leveraged their home to the absolute limit, draining every drop of equity to pour into the black hole of his collapsing business. The house was currently in pre-foreclosure status. He was 3 months behind on his mortgage payments. I stared at the screen, a sickening weight pressing down on my chest. Alicia did not know. At our lunch, she had defended his financial genius with genuine passion. She truly believed she was living the life of a wealthy, untouchable socialite. She had no idea that the marble floors she walked so proudly were essentially owned by aggressive debt collectors, and that she was a single missed payment away from being put out on the street with nothing beyond the clothes on her back. Gavin knew exactly what he was doing. He had quietly gambled away the roof over his own wife's head. He had stripped her of every shred of financial security to rescue himself. He was prepared to let Alicia become a casualty of his enormous financial collapse, sacrificing his own wife to buy himself a little more time. And Alicia, my foolish blinded daughter, was actively helping him destroy me, the only man in a position to shield her from the storm bearing down on her. I closed my laptop and slid it into my burnished oxblood briefcase. The circle of betrayal was unbroken and complete. My wife wanted to poison me for a taste of the luxury she felt the world owed her. My son-in-law wanted to chemically lobotomize me to bury his federal crimes and stay out of a prison cell. And my daughter was defending the very man who was quietly leading her to the slaughterhouse. I got up and walked out of the library into the warm Texas afternoon. I was a man surrounded by enemies, wearing the faces of a loving family. But they had made a fatal error. They believed they had a helpless old man cornered. They did not understand that they had just placed a loaded weapon in the hands of a veteran IRS investigator who knew precisely how to use it. Gavin wanted to play with financial fire. It was time for me to burn his entire world to the ground. I drove back to the house we had shared for more than 4 decades. The broad driveway was empty. Paulette had mentioned that morning she was off to a charity luncheon with some of the well-heeled wives from the neighborhood, a charity luncheon financed in part by the same man she was actively helping to ruin me. I walked through the front door. The grand foyer with its soaring ceilings and imported marble floors no longer felt like a home. It felt like a crime scene waiting to be processed. The stillness inside was heavy and thick. I did not linger. I went straight up the sweeping staircase and into the master bedroom. Paulette kept a personal heavy steel safe at the rear of her walk-in closet, tucked carefully behind a long row of designer shoeboxes. She always believed she was clever, keeping the combination a secret from me. She used the date of our wedding anniversary. I suppose she found some twisted poetry in guarding her darkest secrets behind the very day we stood before God and swore to be faithful to one another. I entered the numbers into the keypad. The heavy door clicked open with a soft, mechanical thud. I reached in and drew out a thick manila folder I had never laid eyes on before. I crossed to the bed and sat on the edge, opening the flap. My heart beat slow and steady against my ribs. I was no longer a heartbroken husband. I was an investigator working through evidence. The first document inside was printed on the heavy, expensive letterhead of a private boutique medical clinic in the wealthiest corner of River Oaks. I read the name at the top of the page, Dr. Arthur Pelham, a high-end concierge physician known for serving the city's elite. I read through the medical evaluation, carefully absorbing every clinical term. It was a comprehensive assessment of my mental and physical condition. According to Dr. Pelham, I was suffering from rapid-onset Lewy body dementia and severe unrecoverable cognitive decline. The report stated in cold professional language that I was prone to violent outbursts, frequent memory lapses, and a complete inability to manage my own basic daily needs. It concluded that I required immediate full-time institutionalized care for my own safety. The medical report carried an official date from 3 days prior. I had never once crossed paths with Dr. Arthur Pelham in my life, never set foot through the doors of his upscale clinic. Gavin had gone out and purchased himself a corrupt physician, a man willing to auction off his medical license and his professional integrity for a fat envelope of untraceable cash. They were constructing an airtight paper trail of my mental decline without me ever sitting in a waiting room. I turned to the second document in the folder, and the air dropped straight out of my lungs. It was a sweeping, durable financial power of attorney. I worked through the legal language with care. That document granted Paulette absolute and total authority over every bank account, investment portfolio, and piece of real estate held in my name. It spelled out in plain and explicit terms the right to transfer, sell, or leverage the legacy block as collateral against commercial business loans. It handed my wife the full legal power to sign my entire life away to her son-in-law. I looked down to the bottom of the last page. There on the designated signature line sat my name written in dark black ink. I brought the paper up close and studied it hard. It was a remarkably good forgery. It carried the slight forward lean of my cursive and the sharp aggressive loop on my capital letter. An amateur would never question it, but 35 years of auditing tax returns and corporate filings had sharpened my eyes to catch the hesitation buried inside a fraudulent pen stroke. I could see exactly where the pen had lingered, just a fraction of a second too long. The ink pressure was all wrong. Gavin must have spent hours hunched over his desk, tracing my old checks, drilling my handwriting again and again, until he felt bold enough to commit a massive federal crime. Right alongside my counterfeit signature sat a small blank circle waiting for a notary public's stamp. I stared at that empty space, and the full scope of their timeline snapped into focus. That blank ring was the missing piece of their entire puzzle. A legal notary cannot stamp a document of this weight without the signatory being physically present of sound mind, or rendered completely incapacitated by a documented medical emergency. That is precisely why Paulette was slipping haloperidol drops into my morning coffee. They needed the poison to finally push my body over the physical edge. They needed me to crumple in the living room, to be rushed to an emergency room, babbling, trembling, and utterly incoherent. Once I was strapped to a hospital bed, legally documented by attending nurses as a danger to myself, they could wheel in a corrupt notary on Gavin's payroll to stamp the document and seal my fate. They were waiting purely and simply for my mind to short-circuit so they could plunder $30 million. A surge of raw, violent fury rolled through every part of me. My hands balled into tight fists, crumpling the thick legal paper at its edges. My first primal impulse was to shred those documents into 1,000 pieces. I wanted to storm downstairs, feed them to the fireplace, and stand there watching their master plan go up in flames. I wanted to plant myself in the living room, wait for Paulette to walk through the front door, and pitch those ashes straight into her face. I wanted to watch the color drain from her when she understood that her grand scheme had been destroyed. But anger makes a man sloppy. Anger makes you act before you think. If I destroyed the papers, Gavin would simply print new ones. If I confronted Paulette, she would deny everything on the spot, cast herself as the victim, and push their timeline forward. They would know I had uncovered them, and they would find another way to remove me, a quicker way, a more brutal way. I drew a long, ragged breath, forcing the furious husband back under the surface and pulling the cold, calculating IRS auditor back up into the light. I smoothed the crumpled edges of the forged documents flat against the mattress. I gathered the papers and moved quickly to my home office. I powered up my high-resolution and document scanner. I laid the fraudulent medical diagnosis from the dirty doctor face down on the glass and scanned it. I set the forged power of attorney with my counterfeit signature flat on the glass and scanned it. I saved the high-definition digital copies to an encrypted offshore cloud server that Paulette didn't even know existed. I printed one physical copy of everything and locked it inside a hidden compartment built into my desk. Then I took the original fraudulent documents and walked quietly back to the master bedroom. I laid the pages carefully back inside the manila folder, arranged it exactly as I had found it, and slid it precisely into its place at the back of the heavy metal safe. I closed the thick steel door and spun the combination dial. The lock clicked shut, sealing their treachery back in the dark. I pushed the designer shoeboxes back into their exact original positions, leaving not a single trace that I had ever been there. I went downstairs to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of ice-cold water. My hands were perfectly steady on the glass. The heavy doses of haloperidol were slowly clearing out of my system, but I knew I had to keep the performance going. The next morning, I would have to take my seat at the dining room table and let Paulette pour my poisoned coffee. I would have to pretend to sip it when her eyes were on me, and quietly spit the liquid into a hidden napkin the moment she looked away. I would have to make my hands tremble. I would have to stare blankly at the walls and act as though I had forgotten what day it was. I had to make them believe without a shadow of doubt that their slow-acting poison was working exactly as planned. Paulette and Gavin believed they had cornered a weak and dying animal. They thought every winning card in this high-stakes game was in their hands. But they had just passed me the physical, tangible proof of their federal crimes. That forged power of attorney was not their golden ticket to a $30 million real estate fortune. It was their one-way passage to a federal penitentiary. The trap was fully laid, and I was standing there holding the cage door wide open, waiting patiently for them to step inside. The cat and mouse game had officially begun. Standing in that quiet kitchen, staring at the empty coffee pot, I smiled because they had absolutely no idea which one of us was the cat. I drove down to 3rd Ward the following morning. It is a part of Houston that carries deep history for our people. The kind of history that arrogant men like Gavin are always trying to bury beneath glass towers and steel frames. I pulled up in front of a modest brick building that looked as though it hadn't changed since the 1970s. Inside was the law office of Reuben. Reuben and I had come up together in the same hard neighborhoods. We'd lived through the civil rights movement side by side. While I walked into the IRS to hunt financial predators with numbers and ledgers, Reuben went to law school and became one of the sharpest, most relentless defense attorneys in the state of Texas. He had no interest in designer suits or exclusive country club memberships. He cared about the law, and he cared about loyalty. I walked into his office, which smelled strongly of old paper and bitter black coffee. I sat down across from his heavy oak desk and laid out everything. I held nothing back. I told him about the hidden camera and the poison in my morning coffee. I told him about the $25 million debt Gavin was concealing behind his luxury cars and rehearsed smiles. I told him about the dirty doctor and the forged power of attorney currently sitting inside my wife's safe. Reuben listened in total silence. His dark eyes tightened and his jaw set like stone. When I finished, he didn't offer me sympathy or empty comfort. He knew I wasn't looking for any. He simply drew a fresh legal pad in front of him, leaned forward and asked me exactly how I wanted to execute the execution. I told him I needed an irrevocable trust, and I needed it drafted and filed without delay. For anyone unfamiliar with complex property law, an irrevocable trust is precisely what it sounds like. It is a legal vault. Once you place an asset inside it, you permanently surrender your direct legal ownership of that asset. The trust becomes the absolute owner, and a designated trustee manages it on your behalf. You cannot reverse your decision later, and no outside force can compel you to dissolve it. I told Reuben to draw up the documents transferring the entire $30 million legacy block out of my personal name and into the newly formed Whitfield Family Legacy Trust. I named Reuben as the sole managing trustee. By the time I pressed my signature to the bottom of that thick stack of legal papers, the legacy block officially no longer belonged to Delroy. It had become a legal ghost, and that meant the forged power of attorney that Gavin and Paulette were clutching was now completely and utterly worthless. You cannot wield a power of attorney to seize an asset the person no longer owns. Gavin was gearing up to rob a vault I had already quietly drained. Reuben pressed the heavy seal onto the trust documents and looked up at me with a grim, satisfied smile. He told me the property was locked down tighter than a Federal Reserve. He said it was time to let them hang themselves. I walked out of his office and drove back to my house in the sprawling suburbs. The legal trap was perfectly set, but I needed to keep the physical trap wide open. I needed them to go on believing they were winning this twisted game. That meant returning to my own home and delivering the performance of a lifetime. The haloperidol was still somewhere in that house, and I knew Paulette was still slipping it into my drinks every chance she got. I kept to my daily routine with extreme caution. Each cup of coffee and glass of water she handed me, I quietly disposed of, pouring the liquid down the bathroom sink or drawing it into a thick sponge I kept hidden deep in my pocket. But my body had to show the symptoms they were counting on. I had to become the ghost they wanted to see. That evening, I walked into the living room to put on my grand performance. I made sure to wear my left house slipper and a right leather dress shoe. I shuffled heavily, dragging my heels along the hardwood floor, producing a slow, pathetic scraping sound. Paulette was settled on the sofa, flipping through a luxury home magazine, probably selecting imported Italian furniture she intended to buy with my life savings. I stopped in the middle of the room and looked around with wide, vacant eyes. I let my jaw go slack and allowed my hands to shake violently at my sides. I turned to look directly at Paulette and let my face register total, terrifying confusion. I stared at the woman I had slept beside for 45 years and asked her who she was. I asked her what she was doing sitting in my house. I watched the woman I had married look back at me with an absolute chilling coldness. She did not drop the magazine in shock. She did not rush over to comfort a sick husband. She did not ask whether I was all right or offer to call an ambulance. Instead, a slow, triumphant smirk spread across her face. Her eyes lit up with pure, greedy validation. She reached for her phone on the glass coffee table. She didn't even try to hide what she was doing. Her thumbs moved rapidly across the screen. I knew exactly who was on the other end of that message. She was telling Gavin the poison had finally broken my mind. She was telling him that the great Delroy was gone, and the time had come to finalize their plan. I stood there playing the shattered, helpless old man, while she gleefully reported my mental collapse to her son-in-law right in front of my face. It took every ounce of discipline I had built over 35 years as a federal investigator not to drop the act. I wanted to straighten my back, stop the trembling, and show her the monster she had just woken up. But I swallowed my pride and kept shuffling, kept playing the fool. Later that night, when the house had gone completely silent and Paulette was fast asleep dreaming of her stolen millions, I slipped back into my dark home office. I brought up my encrypted laptop. Over the previous 2 days, I had assembled a massive comprehensive digital dossier on Vanguard Real Estate Solutions. I had Gavin's bank routing numbers. I had the precise details of his offshore shell companies. I had the digital transfer logs showing him pulling money from new investors to desperately cover the old ones. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme documented with flawless federal precision. I had mapped Gavin's $25 million fraud so clearly that a first-year accounting student could have secured a conviction. I printed all 200 pages of financial evidence. The printer hummed quietly in the dark, spitting out page after page of Gavin's absolute ruin. I packed the thick stack into a heavy unmarked manila envelope. I left no return address on it. I slipped out the back door into the cool Texas night air. I drove 2 towns over, making certain I was well outside my own neighborhood. I pulled up to a blue postal drop box standing beneath a flickering street lamp. The envelope was addressed directly to the regional director of the FBI field office in Houston. I had also put together a carbon copy package bound for the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS, my old division. I knew the people who would open that package. I had trained some of them myself. I knew they did not set aside a perfectly packaged financial crime, especially one involving $25 million in federal wire fraud and brazen investor deception. I pushed the thick envelope through the metal slot. It dropped into the bin with a heavy, satisfying thud. The irrevocable trust would protect my legacy and keep my property out of their blood-stained hands. My daily performance would keep them blind and confident, and the federal government would handle the rest. I drove home in the dead of night, ready to play the dying man one final time. Gavin and Paulette believed they were racing toward the finish line of a brilliant heist. They had no idea they were heading straight for the edge of a cliff, and I had just cut the brakes. The doorbell rang at precisely 2:00 in the afternoon on a gloomy Thursday. I was seated in my favorite leather armchair in the living room, staring blankly at the muted television screen. Paulette was hovering nearby, wiping imaginary dust from the mantel. She had spent the entire morning making sure the house looked absolutely perfect for our special guest. She was dressed in a conservative beige dress, projecting every inch of the exhausted but devoted wife. The performance was nauseating. Gavin came through the front door moments later, escorting a man who looked far less like a medical professional and far more like a high-priced defense attorney. This was Dr. Arthur Pelham, the man whose signature was currently sitting on a forged medical evaluation inside my wife's hidden safe. He wore a tailored navy blue suit, a silk tie, and a gold watch that caught the afternoon light. He carried no traditional medical bag, just a sleek leather briefcase. I did not turn my head when they entered. I kept my eyes fixed on the television screen, letting a thin string of drool collect at the corner of my mouth. I let my left hand tremble against the armrest of the chair. I was 70 years old, a black man who had spent his entire life constructing a legacy from nothing. And here I was, forcing my own body to mimic the devastating decay of the human mind, just to survive the people who claimed to love me. Dr. Pelham walked over and positioned himself in front of my chair. He did not bend down to meet my eyes. He looked down at me with an expression of complete indifference. He did not see a human being. He saw a transaction. He saw a down payment on a new sports car or a luxury vacation. "Well, let us take a look at him," Dr. Pelham said, his voice smooth and stripped of any genuine medical concern. Paulette immediately swept to his side, pressing a hand over her mouth as though holding back a wave of tears. She told him I had been getting worse with every passing day. She said I was wandering the halls at night, forgetting my own name, growing agitated over nothing. She deserved an Academy Award for the sheer conviction in her voice. Dr. Pelham drew a pen from his pocket and finally crouched down in front of me. He asked if I knew what day it was. He asked me who the president was. I slowly rotated my head toward him. I made sure my eyes were completely vacant, no spark, no recognition, nothing behind them. I let my jaw hang open. I mumbled something incoherent, running my words together until they dissolved into pure noise. I raised my trembling hand and batted weakly at the air in front of his face as though swatting at something only I could see. Gavin stood leaning against the living room doorframe with his arms folded across his chest. He watched the whole spectacle with a smug, satisfied smirk. He was enjoying every second of it. He was getting a genuine thrill out of seeing the man who had rejected his business proposals for 5 years, now reduced to a babbling shell. Dr. Pelham did not check my blood pressure. He did not test my pupil response with a light. He did not perform a single legitimate cognitive evaluation. He simply rose back to his feet, smoothed the wrinkles from his expensive suit trousers, and exhaled a heavy theatrical sigh. He turned to Paulette, set a hand on her shoulder, and gave her a look of deep counterfeit sympathy. "Mrs. Whitfield, I am deeply sorry," he said, his tone coated in practiced grief. "My assessment confirms what I dreaded. The deterioration is profound and cannot be reversed. We are dealing with advanced stage dementia. Allowing him to oversee his own finances or remain without full-time supervised care is simply no longer an option." Paulette broke into a theatrical sob, pressing both hands over her face. Gavin moved across the room and wrapped an arm around his mother-in-law, assuming the posture of the steadfast family protector. He inquired about the appropriate legal procedures going forward, asked it with the easy nonchalance of a man running through a script he had memorized weeks ago. Dr. Pelham reached into his briefcase and produced a sheaf of authoritative-looking paperwork. Every page was a mirror of what I had already photographed and secured. He spread the documents across the glass coffee table right there under my nose. The cap came off an expensive fountain pen. He saw no reason to step into another room for privacy. He bent forward and scratched his signature across the designated line, formally and legally branding me incompetent right there, with me watching every stroke. He wore a thin, contemptuous smile as he slid the completed psychiatric evaluation toward Gavin. "It is done," he murmured. "You can take this directly to a judge to expedite the power of attorney and the facility placement. Just make sure the final payments are routed to the offshore account we discussed." Gavin received the papers, pressed them into a neat fold, and pushed them deep into his jacket pocket. Then he came to stand over my armchair. He crouched low, bringing his face right down level with mine. The sharp sting of expensive mint cologne came off him in waves. His hand landed on my shoulder, deliberate, heavy, each pat a small act of dominance. "It is okay, Dad." He breathed every syllable wrapped in quiet, triumphant poison. "Do not you worry about a thing anymore. We are going to take real good care of your assets from now on. You just rest." I held his gaze, my eyes wide and glassy, my fingers still quivering against the leather of the armrest. He was certain he was staring at a man whose mind had caved in. He believed he had just lifted $30 million in prime Houston real estate right out from under me. He was sure the game was over, and he had won. What Gavin failed to grasp was who exactly he was dealing with. A man who spent 35 years running down financial predators who overestimated their own intelligence. I do not walk into any room without the right tools. My eyes dropped briefly to my own chest. Flush against the fabric of my cardigan, blending seamlessly among the plain brown buttons, sat a precision micro camera, purchased from a specialty surveillance shop downtown, paid for in cash, that left no trail. Wide-angle optic, highly sensitive directional audio. Gavin and Paulette believed the living room examination was the curtain call on their performance, but they had stepped on a landmine 10 minutes before the doctor ever touched his pen. The moment Gavin opened the front door to admit Dr. Pelham, Paulette was still in the back of the house, drawing water from the kitchen. Those two men stood together in the entrance foyer for a full 2 minutes. My chair faced that hallway dead on, with nothing between me and the front door. The button camera never stopped running. It captured Gavin's hand moving into his coat. It captured the thick white envelope stuffed with $100 bills changing hands. It captured Gavin's voice in clean, undeniable audio. Here is the second half of the 50,000 we agreed on. Just sign the damn paper and make it look convincing." It captured Dr. Pelham's greedy laugh as he drove the bribe into his briefcase, then straightened his jacket and strolled in to deliver his fraudulent verdict. The whole federal crime was riding on a secure memory card pressed right against my chest. Conspiracy, medical fraud, bribery, elder abuse. A watertight case gift-wrapped and delivered to me without my having to ask. I produced a vague, muddled groan and kept the senile performance running as Gavin's hand hit my shoulder one final time. "Go ahead and celebrate," I thought. "Sleep well tonight. Dream about every dollar of that money you are never going to collect." The evidence stitched into my shirt was headed to federal hands before the clock struck midnight. These two had excavated their own destruction and personally handed me the instrument to bury them. Holding a fraudulent medical certificate and a counterfeit power of attorney in his pocket, Gavin behaved like every cornered man who has just spotted a rope. He grabbed it without a moment's thought. He didn't even clear my front door before the schemes began. The instant Dr. Pelham's footsteps faded down the walk, Gavin was moving fast toward my home office, pulling the doors firmly shut at his back. He believed those closed doors meant safety. He pictured himself as the most calculating person on the premises. Not once did it occur to him that a man who built a career exposing financial fraud would leave his own operations center without protection. Weeks prior, I had run a tap through my entire home network. Each keystroke outbound message and telephone call traveling across my router fed silently into an offshore server that only I could access. There I sat in the living room, still playing the vacant slack-jawed husband for Paulette's benefit, while a slim earpiece tucked into my left ear delivered a live feed of Gavin, methodically destroying himself in the next room. I could hear his footsteps restless back and forth on the hardwood. His breath came out uneven, riding the edge between excitement and raw fear. A phone was lifted. An international number was dialed. The country code landed in my ear, and I placed it without hesitation. Switzerland? Every domestic door had been sealed against Gavin. Each bank of consequence in Texas had reviewed the smoking ruin of his financials and turned him away. With nowhere left to turn at home, he was going after the shadow markets of a reclusive European investment consortium with a long history of injecting unregulated capital into situations that legitimate institutions wouldn't touch. Their terms were punishing. Their collateral requirements were absolute. I kept listening as the connection went through. Gavin assembled his most commanding boardroom voice and told the fund's senior managing partner that he had just assumed complete legal authority over the legacy block, a property carrying a market value north of $30 million free of any encumbrance whatsoever. He was calling to request an emergency infusion of $20 million before the week was out, framing it as seed capital to launch a new luxury high-rise development. Every word of it was fiction. Construction was never the point. That $20 million was a tourniquet, the only thing that might stop the hemorrhage from the shadow lenders already closing in, and the Ponzi structure that was days from implosion. Gavin transmitted scanned copies of the counterfeit power of attorney and the fabricated deed paperwork straight to their servers. He was pawning my life's work ground I had fought and sacrificed for, just to keep his operation breathing one more week. But Gavin was maneuvering on a board he didn't recognize. My attorney and I had mapped this play out in advance back when we sealed the irrevocable trust, placing the legacy block permanently beyond anyone's reach but the trustees. We had known the forged papers would be waived at a foreign lender. What Gavin could not have known was that the managing partner on the other end of that call carried a debt to my attorney that no amount of money could fully settle. Some years back, my attorney had guided that same European group through a savage federal tax evasion investigation and kept every principal out of a cell. The favor was enormous. Tonight, we were collecting. Through the earpiece, I tracked the investor's deliberate pause, the sound of a man pretending to weigh fraudulent collateral he had already been briefed on. Then he delivered the lines my attorney had scripted for him. He told Gavin the assets checked out. He confirmed the $20 million wire would land in Gavin's corporate account by Monday morning. The sound that came back across that phone was unmistakable, a shuddering exhale, then an actual laugh, the laugh of a man convinced he had just outmaneuvered the world. Then the investor tightened the vise. A transaction of this size with a brand new overseas client, he explained, demanded a visible public declaration of confidence. He pointed out that Vanguard Real Estate's 10-year anniversary gala was scheduled for this coming Saturday evening at the Hotel Grand Duca Houston, shaping up to be the premier social occasion of the season, drawing Houston's power elite elected officials and the full force of the local press. The terms were non-negotiable. The $20 million would not move unless Gavin staged a formal signing ceremony on the gala floor. He was to stand before 500 of the city's most prominent faces and make a public declaration, the acquisition of the legacy block, the alliance with the European Fund, all of it announced out loud on record in front of witnesses. It was a brilliant, flawless trap. We were forcing Gavin to execute his massive federal fraud in the most public, thoroughly documented setting imaginable. He wouldn't be signing those counterfeit documents in some shadowed back room. He'd be doing it under the full glare of press cameras, encircled by witnesses, his guilt cemented for the record. Gavin paused for only a fraction of a second. His ego was far too enormous to recognize the jaws closing around him. The prospect of ascending a stage as the triumphant, untouchable business titan before the entire city was simply too intoxicating to decline. He jumped at it. He promised the investor a spectacle worth remembering. He ended the call with no idea he had just countersigned his own ruin. A few minutes later, Gavin came out of the home office practically humming with victory. He swept into the living room, caught Paulette by the waist, and kissed her. He spun her around, laughing like a man who had lost his mind. "We did it," he said against her ear, his voice shaking with raw greed. "The funding is locked in. We are signing the final papers this Saturday at the gala. We are going to be richer than God." Paulette's response was a cool, calculated smile that turned my stomach. She poured him a glass of my scotch from my own cabinet to mark the occasion. Then the smile slipped just slightly, and her eyes drifted toward me. I was still fixed in my armchair, gaze aimed at nothing sustaining my hollow performance. "What about him?" Paulette asked, dropping her voice to a tight whisper. "He cannot be here on Saturday. This gala is the most important night of your career, Gavin. Alicia and I need to be at your side. We cannot leave him alone in this house, and bringing in a sitter is out of the question. What if he has one of his episodes? What if he wanders into the street and the police get called? That becomes a public relations catastrophe. We cannot afford that kind of distraction this weekend." Gavin took a measured sip of scotch, regarding me with undisguised contempt. "You are right," he said, his tone cold and final. "The power of attorney takes effect immediately. There is no reason to hold off any longer. He is dead weight now." Paulette gave a brisk nod, then moved to the kitchen counter and retrieved a glossy brochure. I knew the logo the instant I saw it. Pinecroft Manor, a notorious state-run facility on the edge of town. Not a place where aging people find comfort and dignity. A heavily medicated lockdown ward where inconvenient relatives are deposited and forgotten. Chronically underfunded, chronically short-staffed, and built on a philosophy of keeping residents heavily sedated so they never become a nuisance. "I already handled the arrangements," Paulette said, her voice stripped of anything resembling human feeling. "I paid the administrator a premium to fast-track his admission on an emergency psychiatric hold. The private ambulance arrives at 3:00 Saturday afternoon. They will strap him to a gurney, transport him directly to the secure dementia ward, and close the door behind him. We will be in our evening gowns drinking champagne at the Hotel Grand Duca Houston while he receives his first round of institutional sedatives. He will never walk through this door again." Gavin raised my own scotch in a private toast. "To the future," he said. "To the future," she answered her glass, meeting his with a clean ring. I sat motionless in that chair, listening to the woman I had given 45 years of my life to casually map out my permanent removal into a chemical cage. They were planning to discard me like worn-out furniture mere hours before they intended to parade across a stage and rob my legacy in front of the whole city. They were convinced they had closed every gap. They were certain that Saturday afternoon would be the quiet, unremarkable end of my story. But as I held that blank stare and let my hands lie still in my lap, something deep and dangerous took root in my chest. They wanted an ambulance at my door on Saturday. They wanted me sealed away in the dark, safely out of range to spoil their evening. I was going to let them put me in that ambulance. I was going to let them savor the illusion of victory, because sometimes the only way to utterly demolish your enemies is to first let them believe they have buried you. They were picturing Saturday night as the coronation of their grand deceit. They had no idea I intended to walk through those gala doors myself, with the full weight of the federal government at my back. Saturday afternoon settled over the house like a low, suffocating cloud, while the rest of the household crackled with anticipation ahead of Gavin's enormous corporate event. I remained in my worn armchair in the living room, inhabiting the role of a man already halfway gone. A faded, oversized sweater, old house slippers, chin angled down, fingers trembling faintly against my knees. Then I heard the sharp rhythm of Paulette's heels on the grand staircase. She walked down into the living room, but she was not carrying my weekend bag. She was not holding the solid travel case we had taken to Paris on our anniversary a decade ago. She came in carrying two flimsy gray drawstring bags. Through half-closed eyes, I watched the woman I had been married to for 45 years cross to a heap of my clothing she had already dumped on the sofa. She picked up my sweaters, my socks, my everyday trousers, and fed them into those bags without ceremony, tossing my remaining days away like yesterday's refuse. Not a gesture of care, not a moment of pause. After nearly half a century of shared life, shared beds, shared grief, shared everything, she was compressing what was left of me into disposable plastic. She knotted the first bag and stood over my chair looking down at me with a face carved from stone. Not a single tear, no trace of conflict, no shadow of the woman she had once been. "This place will be good for you, Delroy," she said, her voice flat and stripped of any human warmth. "You are getting dangerous at home. You left the stove on last week. You wander around the house in the middle of the night. It is just not safe for you here anymore. You will be much better off where medical professionals can watch you 24 hours a day." It was a masterfully constructed lie, delivered with the chilling ease of a seasoned sociopath. I had never touched that stove. I had never wandered those halls. She was reciting the invented history she and Gavin had scripted to justify committing me to a chemical prison. Every part of me wanted to raise my head and name exactly what she was. I wanted to lay out everything, the poison, the forgeries, all of it, but I pressed it down, let my chin drop further, kept my eyes fixed blankly on the expensive hardwood floor. Then the front door opened and Alicia walked in, my daughter, the little girl I used to read to sleep, the child whose skinned knees I had bandaged, the young woman whose entire college education I had funded by logging extra hours at the IRS. She was wearing a stunning sapphire blue silk dress, her hair swept up elegantly for the gala that evening. Alicia stopped in the hallway. Her eyes moved from the gray drawstring bag on the floor to me slumped in my chair. For just a moment, a split second barely long enough to register, I caught a flicker of guilt move across her face. I saw the daughter I had raised pushing back against whatever she had allowed herself to become. But the moment collapsed before it could take hold. Alicia quickly turned her head away, cutting her eyes from mine. She drew out her expensive phone and began typing rapidly, performing the pretense of urgent business, feigning obliviousness to her own father being thrown out with the household waste. That silence, that deliberate chosen refusal to meet my gaze, cut deeper than any slow-acting poison Gavin had ever stirred into my coffee. It was the final closing of a door I had spent my whole life trying to keep open. I had no wife left. I had no daughter left. A firm, heavy knock reverberated through the front of the house. Gavin strode out of the home office to answer it, already dressed in his custom-tailored tuxedo, a vulture groomed and ready for the feast. He swung the door wide, and two broad men stepped into my living room. They wore dark blue medical scrubs and carried a thick clipboard between them. They were built for resistance, unsmiling, deliberate, exactly the kind of muscle a place like Pinecroft Manor would dispatch to collect a difficult patient. Delroy Whitfield, the taller orderly, said, his voice rough and stripped of any pleasantries. Gavin stepped forward and handed the men the forged medical authorization he had purchased from the dirty doctor. What is about to unfold is the moment everything either holds together or falls apart, and the people closest to me have no idea which way it is about to go. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you ever discovered that someone you loved had been quietly working against you, would you confront them directly, or would you gather every piece of proof first and let the truth speak for itself? He is docile right now, but he gets confused and turns aggressive. Gavin lied smoothly, sliding his hands into his tuxedo pockets. Take him straight to the secure memory care ward. The administrator is expecting him. The two broad men positioned themselves on either side of my armchair. One locked onto my left arm, the other gripped my right. They hauled me up from the seat without ceremony. I let my legs drag slightly, keeping my knees soft, playing the over-medicated, helpless old man right down to the last detail. As they steered me toward the front door, I passed Paulette. She was positioned in front of the large hallway mirror, carefully working a diamond earring into place. She did not turn around. She offered no goodbye. I passed Alicia. Her eyes stayed welded to her phone screen, jaw set, unwilling to acknowledge that her father was being walked out of his own house. I passed Gavin. He had stationed himself at the door, holding it open. As I shuffled by, he aimed a mocking, triumphant little smirk directly at me. He was convinced he had just claimed a $30 million prize. They guided me down the front steps and out into the warm Texas afternoon. A plain white medical transport van with tinted windows sat waiting in my driveway. The taller orderly wrenched the heavy rear doors open and all but shoved me inside. His partner flung my 2 flimsy gray drawstring bags onto the cold metal floor. The doors banged shut, dropping the interior into dim shadow. The engine turned over. The van backed out of my driveway and rolled away down the street, carrying me from the only home I had known for decades. We traveled in complete silence for roughly 2 miles. I listened to the flow of traffic outside, waiting with patience until I was absolutely certain we had cleared my neighborhood and merged onto the main highway. Then I stopped slouching. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling a gratifying pop travel through my stiff spine. I raised my head. I wiped the fake drool from the corner of my mouth and drew a hand across my face. I reached into my pocket. My hands were no longer trembling. They were as steady as a surgeon's at the moment of first incision. I looked across at the 2 broad men seated opposite me in the back of the van. The taller one, the man who had gripped my arm so firmly, peeled off his medical cap and let out a low, rolling laugh. "You put on a hell of a show back there, Mr. Whitfield," he said, his rough voice shedding its disguise and settling into something sharp and professional. For a second, when we walked into that living room, I actually thought we were collecting a sick old man. I smiled, a real smile, genuine, unhurried, and dangerous. These men had nothing to do with Pinecroft Manor. They were undercover federal agents handpicked and positioned by my attorney, Rubin. This unmarked white transport van was not bound for any dementia ward. It was a fully equipped mobile command unit operating under the joint authority of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the FBI. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded sweater and drew out a small encrypted USB drive. That sliver of plastic held everything: high-resolution scans of the forged power of attorney, the fraudulent medical evaluation bearing Dr. Pelham's signature, crystal-clear hidden camera footage of Gavin pressing a $50,000 cash bribe into Dr. Pelham's hands right there in my hallway, the offshore banking routing numbers documenting his $25 million Ponzi scheme in full, and the recorded audio of my wife and son-in-law coldly engineering my institutionalization. I passed the drive to the federal agent. "It is all there," I said, my voice clean and precise. Every piece of evidence required to place Gavin Colbers and Paulette Whitfield in a federal penitentiary for the remainder of their natural lives. The agent took the drive and immediately slotted it into a ruggedized laptop bolted to the van's steel wall. He entered a security clearance code, then gave me a firm nod, confirming the data was secured and transmitting to headquarters. I looked down at the worn sweater hanging off my frame and the cheap house slippers on my feet. I had played the victim for weeks. I had suppressed my pride, absorbed their poison, and allowed them to treat me as something disposable, all to arrive at this precise moment. But the performance was done. I knocked hard on the metal partition, dividing the cargo area from the front cab. "Agent," I called forward to the driver, "turn this vehicle around and head toward the luxury district in River Oaks. I need to stop at my personal tailor. I will not be dismantling my son-in-law's entire empire dressed in these miserable rags. Move it, gentlemen. I have a very important gathering to attend tonight." The bespoke tailor shop in River Oaks was sealed to the public by the time the federal agents brought me through the rear entrance. Inside the private fitting room, I peeled off the oversized faded sweater and the worn house slippers and dropped them to the hardwood floor. They landed in a pitiful heap. That pile was the sick, diminished old man my family had been so determined to create. I stepped over it without a glance back. My master tailor, an elder Italian craftsman who had been cutting my suits since my earliest years at the Internal Revenue Service, was already waiting. He asked no questions about the armed federal agent posted beside the door. He simply produced the garment bag. I drew on a crisp white Sea Island cotton shirt and secured my heavy platinum cufflinks. Then came the suit. A midnight blue Italian wool three-piece cut from cloth of exceptional weight and tailored to my exact dimensions. I stepped into polished black leather Oxfords. When I turned to face the three-way mirror, there was no trace of a 70-year-old dementia patient destined for a locked ward. I saw a veteran federal fraud investigator. I saw the man who held the deeds to $30 million in prime Houston real estate. I saw an executioner. We departed the tailor and stepped out into the cool evening air. A large, black tactical surveillance van sat discreetly in the alleyway, its heavy side door sliding open as I approached. Inside was a sophisticated mobile command center. The walls carried banks of glowing monitors and layered audio equipment. 3 federal agents in dark tactical gear and headsets worked the control panels. My attorney Ruben occupied a corner seat, a thick burnished oxblood briefcase balanced across his lap. He took in my tailored suit and offered a slow, satisfied nod. He understood precisely what was coming next. We moved through the crowded downtown streets until the van settled into a designated secured loading bay directly beneath the Hotel Grand Duca Houston. The engine fell quiet, leaving only the low hum of the surveillance equipment. We were positioned immediately below the Grand Ballroom, where Vanguard Real Estate Solutions was staging its 10-year anniversary gala. An agent struck a key, and the largest monitor on the wall blinked to life. We had a crystal-clear, high-definition live feed of the entire ballroom. Ruben had arranged for 2 undercover operatives to be embedded in the catering staff, their concealed lapel cameras delivering unobstructed coverage of every corner of the room. The ballroom was a study in extravagance. Enormous crystal chandeliers poured golden light across the floor. Servers in white tuxedo jackets moved through the crowd, carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and imported caviar. 500 of Houston's most influential people filled the Space City Council, members, wealthy socialites, and major corporate investors. It was precisely the kind of gilded spectacle Paulette had always coveted and believed she was owed. I found her immediately on the screen. Paulette was positioned near the center of the room, draped in a sweeping floor-length sequined evening gown that caught the chandelier light with every breath she took. A heavy diamond necklace lay against her collarbone. She was laughing, head tilted back, crystal flute of vintage champagne in hand. She looked radiant. She looked like the undisputed queen of the evening. Watching that wide, luminous smile, you would never suspect that barely 3 hours earlier, she had stuffed her husband of 45 years into drawstring bags and shipped him off to a chemical holding facility. She was toasting my elimination. Beside her stood Alicia in her sapphire blue silk dress, arm threaded tightly through her husband's. She looked slightly tense beneath the performance, but she was holding the part, the loyal, beaming wife of a rising titan. And then there was Gavin. He was already on the main stage at the front of the ballroom, standing in the full wash of a bright white spotlight. He adjusted his custom-tailored tuxedo and tapped the microphone. The low murmur rolling through the well-heeled crowd fell away. The camera drew in close on his face. The man radiated smugness, arrogant to his core, carrying himself like someone who had already won and knew it. He turned that practiced, blinding grin on the room. "Thank you all for coming tonight." Gavin's voice pushed through the surveillance van speakers with perfect clarity. "Tonight we are not just celebrating 10 years of Vanguard real estate. We are celebrating the future of this beautiful city. I am incredibly proud to announce that, as of this afternoon, Vanguard has officially acquired full legal control over the most coveted commercial property in downtown Houston, the historic Legacy Block." A well-mannered ripple of applause moved across the ballroom. On the monitor, I caught Paulette's hands going together enthusiastically, her sequined evening gown throwing light in every direction. Gavin spread his palms wide to settle the room, his outsized ego nearly visible through the screen. This acquisition was not easy. He pressed on, coding every word in a performance of false modesty. It took a lot of careful negotiation and a lot of family sacrifice. But this historic land will serve as the foundation for our newest and most ambitious luxury high-rise project to date. And to fund this monumental vision, I am honored to welcome our new international partners who have flown in from Europe just to be here with us tonight to finalize the deal. I watched the European investment manager, the one quietly working alongside my attorney, ascend to the stage. Under his arm was a sleek leather portfolio stuffed with the loan documents. Another round of applause rolled through the crowd. There he stood, crowing about the theft of everything I had built, performing for the very audience he intended to fleece. His entire narrative rested on forged signatures, poisoned coffee, and $25 million worth of debt he had buried, so no one would find it. In his mind, this night was his crowning achievement, permanent and untouchable. He had no doubt whatsoever that the old man lay heavily sedated in some hospital room, far away, tied to a bed, unable to recall his own name. I shifted closer to the monitor. Every drop of grief and fury that had lived in my chest through those brutal past few weeks had drained completely away. What remained was something colder and more precise than either of those feelings. I watched Gavin clasp the European investor's hand. I watched Paulette draw a long, self-satisfied sip of champagne and beam at the assembled crowd. They had climbed to the highest point on the mountain they had invented for themselves. They were perched at the very top of their own lie. It was exactly the right height for what was coming. At the main console, the lead FBI agent swiveled away from the bank of glowing monitors. Two fingers went to his earpiece as he pulled in an encrypted transmission from the tactical unit's holding position at the ballroom doors upstairs. He set the headset down on the console and turned to face me directly. Nothing in his expression was soft. It was serious, disciplined, and absolute. "The perimeter is completely locked down," he said, voice flat and controlled inside the quiet van. "The undercover agents have secured all the exits. The Financial Fraud Task Force is in position in the main lobby. The target has publicly confessed to the fraudulent acquisition on a live microphone, and the forged documents are currently in his hands." He reached past me and hauled the van's heavy metal door open along its track. A wash of cool, damp air from the underground loading dock poured inside. He held my gaze and gave me one firm, deliberate nod. "The arrest warrants are fully authorized and ready, Mr. Whitfield," the agent said quietly. "The stage is yours." I pushed myself up from my seat. I tugged the crisp cuffs of my Sea Island cotton shirt into place and drew the buttons of my midnight blue suit jacket closed. I wrapped my hand around my solid mahogany walking cane, not for any physical need, but because that cane was part of the image of the old man they were certain they had finished off. I descended from the van onto the loading dock's cold concrete. The feeling of a wronged husband and a cast-aside father had left me entirely. What filled that space instead was something elemental, the pressure you feel in the air just before a storm tears a city open. I moved toward the service elevator that climbed directly to the grand ballroom, and I was ready to reduce their fabricated world to rubble. The car rose in grinding, laboring increments, cables straining as it lifted me out of the loading dock's chill. I didn't move a muscle, both hands settled over the polished handle of my solid mahogany cane. Not for balance. I held it the way a judge holds a gavel. Above the metal doors, each digital number blinked on in sequence, marking off the last moments left in Gavin Colbert's invented empire. On either side of me stood two federal agents, their suits immaculate, their faces unreadable, earpieces dark, eyes forward. Nobody was in a hurry. Power that is genuine never scrambles to arrive. It shows up on its own schedule and not a moment before. The doors parted onto a wide carpeted corridor, tucked directly behind the main ballroom entrance. A pair of ornate heavy doors blocked the way two private security staff posted in front of them. A brief glint of gold badges in the low light was all it took. Both men stepped clear without a syllable. Beyond that carved wood, I could make out Gavin's voice riding the hotel's sound system with ease. That same frictionless, self-certain delivery he used every Sunday when he sat across from me at dinner, trying to push one bad deal or another. He was rapping toward his finish, milking every second of the spotlight. He stood at the very edge of his colossal deception, and he was dragging 500 of Houston's most powerful citizens straight off that edge with him. From the shadows, I listened as he acknowledged the city mayor. I listened as he thanked his equity partners for never losing faith. And then he laid down his last, most calculated card. The dry crack of heavy paper brushing the microphone told me what was coming. He raised the forged power of attorney so the whole room could take it in. With solemn pride, he declared to that vast audience that, through a careful, loving transfer of family assets, Vanguard Real Estate now held absolute legal dominion over the historic legacy block. He described the document as a torch being passed one generation, releasing the flame into the hands of the next. And then, with a brazenness that almost defied comprehension, he asked those people to applaud his father-in-law, informing them I was resting at a specialized care facility, unable to make the trip, but offering my blessing to this grand union from afar. That particular lie turned my blood to something glacial. The room answered him with thunderous floor-shaking applause. They were giving a standing ovation to the man who had hired someone to lace my morning coffee with poison. They were celebrating someone who had quietly bartered away his own wife's financial future to keep his charade running a little longer. Every clap in that room was for a mirage, and beneath the mirage was nothing but blood and betrayal. I cut my eyes to the lead federal agent at my right shoulder. He stepped forward, wrapped both hands around the heavy brass handles, and in a single explosive motion drove those doors apart. They crashed against the walls with a concussive boom that rode straight over the applause and silenced it. The sound hit the room like a shot fired in a cathedral. Every pair of hands at the rear of the ballroom stopped moving at once. A tide of confused faces swung toward the entrance. The string quartet, working quietly in the corner, lost the thread entirely, producing one lurching discordant note before their instruments went dead. That silence didn't stay at the back. It traveled fast, in total sweeping from one end of the enormous room to the other, settling over 500 people like a hard frost. I crossed the threshold and walked into the blaze pouring down from those massive crystal chandeliers overhead. No faded gray sweatpants, no worn-down house slippers scuffing the floor. A midnight blue Italian wool suit, every seam fitted to the precise width of my shoulders. Spine straight as a rifle barrel, face giving away absolutely nothing. I closed my grip on the solid mahogany cane and drove it down from my first deliberate step onto the long, white marble aisle running through the center of the room. Thump. The cane's base connected with that polished stone floor. In a room holding 500 people, not one of them was making a sound. Thump. Another measured step. The wall of socialites, politicians, and real estate figures in their finery began to split apart ahead of me. They peeled back on instinct silk gowns, drawn aside tuxedo jackets pulled clear, creating a corridor they hadn't consciously agreed to make. None of them could have said precisely what was unfolding, but something older than reason was telling them to move. Every one of them understood on a level beneath words that a predator had entered the room. Thump, eyes straight ahead, locked on what was waiting for me at the front. Not the mayor, not the city councilman I had audited with my own hands 2 decades back. Nothing existed in my field of vision except that brightly lit stage. Gavin had gone completely still behind the clear crystal podium. His right hand still held the forged medical power of attorney aloft, but the triumphant grin had vanished from his face. That mask of smug invincibility had crumbled away in an instant, replaced by something raw, pure, paralyzing dread. He had the exact look of a man watching a corpse climb out of the ground and walk toward him. His lips parted slightly, but nothing came out. The sensitive microphone caught every jagged, shallow breath he pulled in. His hand began to tremble, sending the fraudulent document fluttering beneath the stage lights like a wounded thing. Over to the left, near the exclusive VIP tables, stood my wife. Paulette had been glowing just seconds before, wrapped in the warmth of a social standing she had stolen. The moment she saw me moving down that center aisle, every muscle in her body locked up. The color left her face as though someone had pulled a drain. Her fingers went slack. The crystal flute of expensive vintage champagne simply fell away from her grip. It hit the marble floor and burst into a spray of sharp fragments. That piercing sound rang out across the silent ballroom, and she didn't react to it at all. She stood there staring at me, eyes stretched wide, with the dawning understanding that the chemical cage she had paid good money to build around me was standing empty. Beside her, my daughter Alicia lurched backward in shock, colliding hard with a tall cocktail table and sending a heavy floral arrangement toppling. She pressed both trembling hands over her mouth, her gaze flying in a panic from me to her mother, and then up to her husband, standing frozen on the stage above. The magnificent illusion she had worked so hard to protect was coming apart right before her. She had believed I was a broken, over-medicated old man who needed to be locked safely away. She was looking now at the veteran federal fraud investigator who had just methodically taken a wrecking ball to the life she thought she owned. Thump. I reached the front of the room. I planted myself at the foot of the raised stage and looked up at the man who had spent months trying to erase me from existence. The silence pressing down on that ballroom was extraordinary, dense and electric, broken only by the faint drone of the air conditioning moving through the overhead vents. 500 people stood frozen breath, held waiting for the collision that everyone in the room could feel coming. Gavin swallowed. His throat worked visibly once, and then again. He reached for words and found nothing. He bent toward the microphone, his voice splintering into a terrified, barely audible rasp. He managed to force out my name. Delroy. I kept my voice exactly where it was. I had no need to raise it authority that real doesn't require volume. I held his gaze and let the full weight of what I represented settle onto him like a stone dropped from a great height. I am so sorry I am late, I said. My voice was low and steady and cut through the air like something honed to an edge. Every person in that room heard it without effort. I reached up and adjusted my platinum cufflink with a deliberate, unhurried hand. The traffic coming from the nursing home was a bit of a nightmare. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Gavin dragging air past a dry throat. The terror behind his eyes was plain enough for anyone to read, but he was cornered and he had nothing left except one more lie, and men in that position will always reach for it. He clamped his hands to the edges of the crystal podium until the knuckles went white. He pulled together a tight, rigid smile and turned it on the assembled investors and politicians. He pushed out a soft, condescending laugh, working hard to sell himself as a burdened but devoted son-in-law bearing an unfortunate cross. "Ladies and gentlemen, please forgive this unfortunate interruption," Gavin said into the microphone, his voice fraying just enough at the edges to undercut everything he was trying to project. "As I mentioned to some of you earlier this evening, my father-in-law is tragically suffering from advanced rapid-onset dementia. His condition has deteriorated severely in the past few days. He is currently having a severe medical episode. He is deeply confused and he does not know where he is. Please, I apologize for this disturbance." Gavin cut his eyes to the far side of the room and fired a hard, urgent look at the private security team. 4 thick-necked men in dark suits and earpieces peeled away from the walls and came moving fast down the center aisle toward me, all businesslike bouncers clearing a problem patron from the door of a nightclub. Across the audience, murmurs traveled through the crowd and heads shook with sympathetic sighs. Eyes landed on me with pity, written plainly across them. Every one of those people believed they were watching something sad, an elderly man unraveling in public, having slipped past the people paid to look after him. But that pity never had a chance to take root. Before those 4 guards had closed to within 10 feet of me, the 2 agents in tailored suits who had ridden the elevator with me materialized smoothly from the edges of the room. The precision with which they moved was a different category entirely from anything private hotel security could produce. The lead agent stepped directly into the path of the largest guard and raised his left hand. His right hand flipped open a leather wallet, and a gleaming golden federal badge caught the full blaze of the crystal chandeliers above. "Federal agents," he said, voice composed, almost quiet, yet carrying the sort of authority that makes large men stop moving. "Stand down immediately and back away. Do not interfere with this operation." All 4 guards froze on the spot, faces draining as the badges registered. They raised their hands and retreated several long steps back, their post abandoned without another word. A single collective gasp moved through the ballroom in one synchronized wave. The 500 members of Houston's elite suddenly grasped that this was not a family embarrassment playing out in public. This was a coordinated high-level federal takedown, and every one of them was seated squarely inside it. I didn't slow down. I climbed the short run of velvet-carpeted stairs to the main stage, my solid mahogany walking cane tapping out a steady rhythm with every step. I crossed directly to the crystal podium. Gavin recoiled, his whole body shaking badly enough that he nearly brought a tall arrangement of white orchids down with him. The commanding, larger-than-life real estate mogul was simply gone. What remained was a small, terrified man staring into the face of the person who held his fate, a fraud meeting his reckoning. I closed my hand around the microphone and drew it from the stand in one smooth motion. I looked straight into Gavin's panicked, tear-filled eyes. "I have not lost my mind, Gavin," I said, my deep voice filling every corner of that cavernous room through the state-of-the-art concert speakers. "But you are about to lose your freedom." I gave him no time to answer. I turned and sent a brief, deliberate nod toward the audio-visual booth at the far rear of the room. My attorney, Rubin, had locked down the control room with a second undercover federal agent a full 10 minutes before I came through those doors. The massive high-definition LED screens rising behind the stage, which moments ago had been blazing the Vanguard Real Estate logo in bright gold letters, went black all at once. One terrifying second of darkness swallowed the room. Then the screens came back. What they showed was not a corporate presentation. It was hidden camera footage shot inside my own living room. The image was crystal clear, blown up 50 times its original size for every member of Houston's elite society to take in. There, enormous above the stage, was Gavin on my leather sofa, leaning in close toward my wife Paulette. The technician at the back brought the audio up to full. Gavin's own voice captured without fault by the concealed microphone rolled like thunder through that ballroom. 3 drops in his coffee every morning. It mimics Alzheimer's perfectly. We need him incapacitated by the end of the month. Once the doctor signs off on his mental decline, we can activate the power of attorney. We need that land, Paulette. The ballroom's reaction was instant and total. It detonated like a charge set beneath the floor. Socialites cried out, hands flying to their mouths. Men in $1,000 tuxedos shouted in revulsion. Champagne glasses slipped from fingers and burst across the marble floor. On the screen, Paulette gave a slow, deliberate nod, accepted a dark glass vial of poison, and tucked it into her pocket. I do not want any legal issues. Her face, projected enormous above the stage, showed the entire city exactly what she was. I turned and looked out across the crowd. Paulette was still standing where I had spotted her earlier, but there was nothing left of the radiant queen she had been. She was shattered. People were physically pulling away from her faces, twisted with revulsion and horror, as though something monstrous stood in her place. She dropped to her knees right there on the ballroom floor, in her sequined evening gown face buried in both hands, sobbing in heaving waves as the full weight of her public ruin came crashing down. Alicia was a few feet away, crying uncontrollably, head shaking back and forth, as the very crowd she had spent years desperately trying to impress looked at her family with naked disgust. But I was not finished. I had not walked into this room simply to expose a poisoning. I had come to tear down an entire criminal enterprise beam by beam. I gave another nod toward the back of the room. The massive screens behind me blinked and changed. The living room footage disappeared in an instant, replaced by the tight razor-sharp angle of my hidden button camera. The crowd went dead silent once more, riveted by the disaster unfolding before them. The screens showed the grand foyer of my home. They showed Dr. Arthur Pelham, the expensive, widely respected concierge physician who counted half the people in this very ballroom among his patients. They showed Gavin reaching inside his tailored jacket. They showed him withdrawing a thick white envelope stuffed with cash and pressing it directly into the doctor's waiting hands. The audio was crisp and unmistakable. Here is the second half of the $50,000 we agreed on. Gavin's voice rolled across the room. Just sign the damn paper and make it look convincing. The crowd watched in breathless horror as Dr. Pelham laughed and greedily pushed the bribe into his briefcase. The European investment manager, the man who had been standing on that stage gripping the fraudulent $20 million loan documents, went completely pale. He looked at Gavin with a mixture of white-hot fury and total disbelief. He hurled the sleek leather portfolio straight down onto the stage floor, the forged papers scattering across the polished wood. He put as much distance between himself and Gavin as the stage would allow, as if proximity to the man were itself dangerous. The entire ballroom dissolved into absolute chaos. It was a wall of shouting, screaming, and furious disbelief. Investors were yanking out their phones, screaming at brokers and attorneys to freeze every fund and sever every connection to Vanguard real estate. Politicians were stampeding toward the exits, desperate to get clear of the radioactive wreckage of the biggest public scandal in Houston's history. Gavin collapsed. His legs buckled and he went down hard onto the stage floor, landing right beside my polished leather shoes. He curled into a trembling, pitiful heap, hands pulled over his head as the screaming of the enraged crowd crashed over him like a wave. His entire fabricated life, the false wealth, the fraudulent company, the colossal ego, had been reduced to ash in under 3 minutes. I stood over him, weight resting on my solid mahogany walking cane, watching his world finish burning. I did not feel one drop of pity. He had shoveled out this grave himself, with great care, and over a long time. I had simply aimed the light so he could see exactly what he was falling into. Gavin pushed himself up off the hard stage floor. His custom tuxedo was creased and smeared with the dust of his own demolished performance. He scrambled backward like a rat who has just heard the trap spring eyes hunting frantically for any exit from a room that had no escape. He lunged for the crystal podium, where his fraudulent documents lay scattered, He snatched up the thick stack of forged papers and clutched them against his chest as though those flimsy pages could somehow shield him from the damage already done. "That is fake!" he screamed, voice cracking apart under the pressure of sheer desperation. "It is all fake. Do not listen to him. He is a sick old man. He is out of his mind. I have the legal power of attorney right here in my hands." He signed it. The doctor signed it. "The legacy block is mine. It legally belongs to Vanguard Real Estate." He was jabbing a wild finger at the now blank screens behind us, as though he could somehow reach back through time and erase the footage this entire city had just watched. He swept his wide, terrified gaze across the crowd of investors and politicians, silently begging them to accept his crumbling story. Sweat was running freely down his face, cutting through his perfectly styled hair, ruining every inch of the polished image he had sold the world. But not a single person in that grand ballroom was buying it. They were looking at him the way you look at something dead and rotting on the side of the road. I didn't shift so much as an inch. I stood there solid on my mahogany cane, watching him drown in the shallow water of his own delusion. Before Gavin could hurl another desperate lie into the microphone, a different voice cut across the stage. It was deep, unhurried, and weighted with the kind of authority that needs no volume to command a room. "You do not own a single square inch of anything, Gavin." My attorney Reuben stepped out of the darkness of the backstage wings, with the measured pace of a man who already knows how everything ends. He had not come to debate. He had come to read a verdict. He wore a sharp midnight blue suit and carried a heavy burnished oxblood briefcase in his right hand. He moved past the European investor, still hovering near the edge of the stage, staring at Gavin with undisguised contempt. Reuben came to a stop right beside me. He set the briefcase squarely on the crystal podium, pushed Gavin's trembling hands aside, and snapped the brass locks open. The two clicks landed like gunshots in the tense quiet of the ballroom. He lifted out a thick-bound stack of official legal documents stamped with the embossed seal of the state of Texas. Reuben took a moment to look across the 500 assembled elites, making absolutely certain he had every eye in the room. Then he turned his cold, level gaze directly onto my son-in-law. "You are holding a piece of paper that you forged," Reuben said, his voice moving through the sound system with quiet, devastating force. "But even if that medical power of attorney were totally real, it would still be completely and utterly worthless." Gavin stared at him, jaw trembling, his mind apparently unable to process what was being said. "What are you talking about?" Gavin stammered, pressing the forged documents harder against his chest. "It gives me total control of his assets. The land is mine." I filed the paperwork. Reuben let out a short, cold laugh that held not a trace of humor. He lifted the state-stamped document from the briefcase and held it high so the entire room could see it plainly. "The legacy block does not belong to Delroy Whitfield," Reuben announced to the silent room. "It has not belonged to him for exactly 3 weeks. 21 days ago, my client legally and permanently transferred the entire $30 million commercial property into the Whitfield Family Irrevocable Trust. He surrendered all direct personal ownership. I am the sole managing trustee. You cannot use a medical power of attorney to seize an asset that the patient does not even own. You forged a federal document to steal a ghost, Gavin. You own absolutely nothing." Gavin literally stopped breathing. I watched the full devastation of that realization move through his body like a current. The color drained from his neck all the way down to his collar. Paying off dirty doctors and manipulating my own daughter, all of it to crack open an empty vault. But Reuben was not finished. The veteran lawyer leaned in closer to the microphone, dropping his voice to a low, lethal register that sent a visible chill through the crowd. "But your sheer monumental stupidity is not your biggest problem tonight," Reuben continued without mercy. "The problem is what you did with those forged papers before you got here. My client is a retired investigator for the Internal Revenue Service, Gavin. We do not just watch you steal. We watch where you put the money. We have your digital transfer logs. We know that yesterday afternoon, you submitted that fraudulent power of attorney and a fake property deed to a federally insured commercial bank. You needed capital to hold your shadow lenders off, so you used an asset you do not own, backed by a medical signature you forged to secure a $20 million bridge loan. The words hung in the air, absolute and utterly lethal. Reuben turned from Gavin and faced the crowd, making certain every investor, hedge fund manager, and local politician heard the final nail being driven home. "That is not just a standard breach of corporate contract," Reuben declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. That is first-degree federal bank fraud. That is wire fraud. That is grand larceny and conspiracy to commit medical fraud. You did not just bankrupt your company, Gavin. You just bought yourself 25 years in a federal penitentiary. The reaction rolling through that grand ballroom was instantaneous and devastating. The full reality of Gavin's federal crimes hit the crowd of 500 elites like a violent surging tide. These were calculating people who survived on spotless reputations and clean regulated money. Sharing a room with a man who had just committed massive federal bank fraud was a contamination they could not afford under any circumstances. The wealthy socialites and real estate figures did not simply gasp and stand there. They shifted into hard, aggressive corporate survival mode. Every person in the VIP section produced a cell phone at the same moment. The ballroom erupted into a roaring tangle of frantic dialing, furious shouting, and desperate financial commands. I looked out across that sea of expensive suits and silk dresses and watched Vanguard real estate get annihilated in real time. I heard hedge fund managers screaming at their personal brokers, ordering them to shed every share connected to Gavin's development projects before the market opened Monday morning. I watched city politicians frantically waving their panicked aides over barking orders to scrub their names from every zoning permit and public endorsement tied to Vanguard. The European investment manager, the man who had been standing by to provide the final cash injection that would have kept Gavin's entire scheme breathing, picked his sleek leather portfolio up off the stage floor. He fixed Gavin with a look of pure, undiluted financial contempt, spat once onto the polished wood of the stage, and walked straight out through the back double doors without a backward glance. In under 60 seconds, millions upon millions of dollars in private funding. Institutional investment and corporate backing dissolved completely into the air. The empire Gavin had assembled, the proposed glass high-rises, the leased luxury cars, the arrogant country club memberships, all of it evaporated in front of his eyes. The company he had constructed from lies, manipulation, and stolen money was now worth precisely nothing. He was flat broke, but broke was the least of it. He was a radioactive liability drowning in $25 million of toxic debt, hunted by aggressive shadow lenders, and staring down decades in a federal cell. Gavin looked out at the screaming, churning crowd, and what was behind his eyes was a hollow, bottomless despair. His fingers went limp. He let the forged power of attorney go. The fake papers drifted down in slow, lazy turns and came to rest at the tips of my polished leather shoes, useless as ash. He sagged back against the velvet stage curtain, covered his face with both trembling hands, and released a pathetic, high-pitched sob. He was a finished man. The destruction of everything he had built was total, absolute, and beyond any hope of reversal. I stood quietly beside my attorney weight on my solid mahogany walking cane, watching the wealthy elite of Houston reduce my son-in-law's life to wreckage. I did not move to help him. I had done everything a man could do to protect his family, and they had answered me with poison in my morning cup. Now they would sit in the dark and finish every last drop. The chaos gripping the grand ballroom shifted. The frantic financial screaming died away, and a heavy, frightened silence settled in its place as the full mass of the federal government moved out of the shadows. The Houston elite, who had been howling into their phones just moments before, went suddenly and completely mute. They pressed themselves back from the main stage, flattening against the silk-covered walls of the Hotel Grand Duca Houston. They understood what the end of the line looked like. 2 senior agents advanced from the rear of the room. These were not private security in dark suits. They wore heavy tactical vests with IRS criminal investigation blazed across the back in sharp yellow letters. Flanking them were 3 armed FBI agents whose faces were cut from stone. They did not move with the frantic energy of the socialites scrambling around them. They came forward with the slow, unstoppable weight of a verdict that had already been signed and sealed. The lead agent mounted the velvet-carpeted stairs to the stage. His gaze did not sweep the crowd. It went straight to Gavin, who was still folded into a trembling heap near the heavy curtain. Gavin looked up. His face was pale and slick with fear, his custom tuxedo smeared with dust, his carefully arranged hair plastered flat against his forehead. He looked like a small animal caught in the full beam of something enormous and oncoming that cannot be stopped. The lead agent came to a stop directly in front of him. He reached to his tactical belt and brought out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking carried clean across the silent ballroom through the state-of-the-art sound system. Gavin Colbert, the agent, announced, his voice filling the room with the kind of authority that admits no argument. You are under arrest for first-degree securities fraud, massive federal tax evasion, and the premeditated conspiracy to commit murder. Gavin let out a raw, guttural sob. He scrabbled backward, pressing hard into the curtain, as if the solid wall behind it might give way and swallow him. He shook his head in frantic, wild jerks, tears pouring down his face, begging for his lawyer, begging for someone to tell him this was all a terrible mistake. But the agents did not pause or slow. Two large officers seized him by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo and hauled him bodily to his feet. They drove him chest first into the clear crystal podium, which shuddered under the impact, and wrenched both arms behind his back. The steel cuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a loud, definitive click. Gavin crumpled into a fit of broken, high-pitched weeping, every trace of the arrogant mogul stripped away. He was nothing now but a busted thief with decades of a federal cage ahead of him. But the agents were not done. The lead agent turned away from the sobbing wreck on the stage and looked down into the VIP section of the ballroom. He found my wife. Paulette was standing motionless among the shattered pieces of her crystal champagne flute. The women she had spent years cultivating, wealthy wives of politicians and hedge fund managers, were physically pulling away from her, drawing their expensive silk gowns tight to avoid any contact with a woman who was seconds away from being handcuffed. Paulette's eyes swept the room in rapid, desperate arcs, hunting for a single face that might offer her something. She found nothing but cold, disgusted judgment on every side. The lead agent came down from the stage and walked directly toward her. His heavy boots ground the broken glass into the marble floor with each step. He halted just inches from her face, entirely unmoved by the expensive perfume she wore or the heavy diamond necklace resting at her collarbone. Paulette Whitfield. The agent said, his voice cutting clean through the charged air of the ballroom. You are under arrest for accessory to attempted murder wire fraud and the federal forgery of medical documents. The meaning of those words finally broke through. The grand glittering illusion she had constructed around herself came apart all at once. She was not walking out of this hotel as the matriarch of a real estate dynasty. She was going out through the service elevator in handcuffs loaded into the back of a federal transport van. The agent moved to take her wrist, and in that exact moment, something in her mind gave way entirely. Paulette wrenched free of his grip, lurching sideways on her heels. She threw herself forward with a frantic, shrieking cry, stumbling toward the stage. She went down hard on both knees at the very edge of the elevated platform, right at the tips of my polished leather shoes. The impact was brutal, but she showed no sign of feeling it. She thrust out her trembling hands and seized fistfuls of my midnight blue trouser legs. She began to weep in a way that was beyond controlling. This was not a quiet, composed cry. It was a loud, wretched wail that climbed all the way up to the crystal chandeliers. The thick coat of designer makeup she had layered on so precisely hours earlier ran in dark, muddy rivers down her face. Delroy. She screamed, her voice fracturing under the weight of sheer terror. Delroy, please, you have to stop them. Please tell them to stop. I am your wife. We have been married for 45 years. You cannot let them do this to me. She tilted her face up toward mine, a mask of desperation and raw fear. She pulled at my trousers, her diamond rings flaring under the stage lights. She believed she could still work me. She thought she could reach inside and pull at the strings of the man who had loved her for nearly half a century. Please, Delroy. She sobbed, tears and mascara falling onto the white marble below. I swear I did not want to do it. Gavin forced me. I only did it for our daughter. I only went along with the plan to make sure Alicia was safe and taken care of. I did it for our family, Delroy. Please forgive me. I looked down at the woman on her knees at my feet. I felt no pity, not a flicker. The love I had carried for her across 45 years was simply absent, hollowed out, and replaced by the cold, exacting steadiness of a man who had been brought to the edge of death by the person he trusted most. I looked at the hands gripping my trousers. These same hands that had measured out drops of a chemical lobotomy into my morning coffee while humming a cheerful gospel song. She had assessed my life, weighed it, and decided it was worth a luxury condo and a handful of social club invitations. I made no move to pull away. I stood with my full weight settled onto my solid mahogany walking cane and held her gaze, letting the absolute glacial cold of my stare pass through every excuse she had left. My voice came out steady low and stripped of any mercy. It moved through the hushed ballroom, cutting straight through her hysterical sobbing. "You did not poison your husband for our daughter." I said each word landing on her like something solid and heavy. "You poisoned me for that sequined evening gown you are wearing right now. You traded 45 years of my life for vintage champagne and the hollow approval of people who are currently watching your destruction." Paulette's breath caught. Her eyes went wide as the full force of my judgment settled onto her, with no softness in it at all. "Now, let go of my suit," I told her, my voice carrying with a finality that left no room for negotiation. "Stand up and try to hold on to whatever is left of your dignity." Her hands lost their strength. Her fingers slowly uncurled and fell away from the fabric. She collapsed forward, broken and finished. 2 federal agents moved in behind her, taking hold of her arms and drawing her firmly to her feet. They pulled her wrists back, and the sharp snap of the second pair of handcuffs rang through the ballroom. They walked her out her head, dropping toward her chest, her sequined evening gown trailing across the floor behind her. I remained on the stage and watched them guide my wife and my son-in-law through the back doors, leaving nothing in their wake but the wreckage of their own greed. The heavy doors swung shut. The brass latch clicked in the silence. Gavin and Paulette were gone, being walked through the service corridors down to the loading dock, where the tactical van sat waiting to carry them to a federal holding facility. I stood on the elevated stage leaning on my solid mahogany walking cane, watching the red and blue strobes from the police cruisers outside pulse against the tall glass windows. The 500 members of Houston's elite were completely motionless. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room was thick with the suffocating atmosphere of demolished reputations and punctured egos. Every eye in the room was fixed on the empty space where the golden couple of real estate had been standing just minutes before. And then there was Alicia. My daughter was left standing entirely alone in the center of the VIP section. The wealthy socialites she had spent 5 years working desperately to impress were pulling away from her in real time. They gathered their silk wraps, took their husbands by the arm, and steered toward the exits, refusing to cast so much as a glance in her direction. She was a stranger in the world she had fought to build. Her eyes moved in wild, darting sweeps as she watched her entire social circle vanish around her. Then her gaze found the stage. It found me. Alicia gathered the skirt of her sapphire blue silk dress and came toward the velvet stairs at a run. She stumbled in her heels and nearly went down, but caught herself and scrambled up onto the platform. She threw her arms around my neck and pressed her face hard into the lapel of my midnight blue suit, and the sobs that came out of her were loud and shaking. Her tears soaked through my Sea Island cotton shirt. "Daddy, please!" she cried, her voice fracturing with terror and desperation. "Daddy, I did not know. I swear to God, I did not know they were poisoning you. I never would have let them do that to you. I did not know about the drops in your coffee. You have to believe me, Daddy. You are my father, and I love you. Please tell me you believe me." For a moment, I let my eyes close. I felt the physical weight of my only child pressing against me, begging for the shelter and protection I had given her from the day she was born. A weaker man would have come apart. A weaker man would have pulled his daughter close, smoothed her hair, and told her it would all be fine. But I was not a weak man, and I knew exactly who was weeping on my shoulder. I did not return the embrace. My arms stayed at my sides. I stood like something cast from stone until her frantic sobbing began to break down into uneven, stuttering breaths. I raised both hands. I wrapped my fingers around her wrists and carefully unwound her arms from my neck. I stepped back, opening a cold space between us. I looked straight into her eyes. Her face was a ruin of smeared makeup and naked panic. "I believe you, Alicia," I said, my voice level and entirely without warmth. "I believe that you did not know about the holy paradol. I believe Gavin and your mother kept the actual poisoning from you so you could keep your plausible deniability intact." Alicia let out a long breath of relief. She reached toward me, trying to take my hand. "Thank God," she whispered, a hopeful smile breaking through her tears. "I knew you would understand. We can fix this, Daddy. We can start over. Just you and me. We do not need them." I withdrew my hand before her fingers could make contact. The hopeful smile on her face locked in place and then slowly fell apart as she read my expression. "You did not know about the poison." I went on, the words reaching her like measured blows. "But you knew everything else. You knew Gavin was drowning in $25 million of toxic debt. His company was a fraud, you knew that. Every layer of it a lie, and you understood exactly what it was. And those medical documents, the ones bearing my forged signature, you knew about those too, because you sat at that table and watched your mother rehearse my handwriting until she had it right. Alicia reeled back, head shaking frantically, the sapphire dress swishing across the stage beneath her feet. No, Daddy, that is not true. I was scared of him. Gavin manipulated me too. Don't you dare talk to me about intelligence. Alicia? I said, my voice tightening just enough to cut through the silence between us. I was at that table with you, the bistro in River Oaks. I put an exit right in front of you and you chose not to take it. The legacy block I was willing to place it in, a trust with your name on it alone. A firewall between you and whatever financial wreckage he was heading toward. So, what happened? You picked up your phone under the table and fired off a text to your husband, a warning that the foolish old man was trying to shut him out of his windfall. Then you sat there, looked straight at me and said, I'd lost my grip on reality, that I was an obstacle standing between you and everything you deserved. Her mouth came open, but the words never arrived. The weight of what was true had become something she couldn't fight her way up from. This afternoon, I said, moving toward her close enough that she had nowhere to look, but at the revulsion plain on my face. You were standing in the corridor of my own house. You had on that stunning, costly silk gown, and you watched two men you'd never met haul your father out the door to be locked inside a medicated fog. You watched my whole existence get crammed into two flimsy gray drawstring bags, and you turned away. You kept your eyes on that phone screen because the comfort of your life as a rich man's wife was worth more to you than the man who had spent decades building you up. I am sorry, she cried out, her knees hitting the stage floor, both hands pressed over her face. I was just so afraid of losing everything. I was so afraid of being poor. My hand went inside the breast pocket of my jacket. What I removed was a single page of thick white paper, crisp and tri-folded with care. I opened it one fold at a time, pressing the creases smooth with my thumb. Then I let it fall from my fingers, settling on the polished floor directly before her shaking knees. The man you chose to marry, he was the one worth fearing, I said, keeping my voice low and even. While you were occupied tearing me down alongside him, he was quietly burning through every last thing you had. Read it, Alicia. Her hands came down slowly. The mascara had surrendered entirely, carving black trails down her face. Her fingers, still unsteady, reached out and collected the document from the floor. She took in the heavy typeface running across the top of the page. It bore the official seal of the largest commercial bank operating in the state of Texas. That document is a foreclosure notice, I told her, watching the horror register behind her eyes as the legal language resolved into meaning. That great suburban estate you're so proud of your husband never owned it outright. Over the course of 8 months, he leveraged it 3 separate times, stacking mortgages on top of mortgages to keep oxygen in a dying scheme. He has been 90 days delinquent on those payments. Yesterday morning, the bank took possession of the property. By tomorrow afternoon, an eviction order will be posted on your door. The sound Alicia made was airless, gutted. The paper fell from her grip, like something that had scalded her. Her gaze came up to find mine, and what I saw in her eyes was vacancy, the proud certainty she had worn for 5 years, simply gone. He stripped you of everything, I said, my voice settling into something barely above a murmur. The money, the house, the position you built your whole identity around, your family. He cashed all of it in to sustain the illusion for a little while longer, and you were the one who put the instrument in his hand. Daddy, please, she whimpered, edging forward on her knees across the stage floor, the hem of her gown dragging behind her. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do? You cannot just leave me like this. I have nothing. I stood over the daughter I had guarded and cherished for 35 years. Whatever remained of the thread connecting me to the fiction of my family gave way in that moment, and I was free of it. My hand found my solid mahogany walking cane. I straightened my spine and rotated away from her. Alicia, you leave here with nothing, I said, and there was not one beat of uncertainty in it. Welcome to the real world. I didn't give her the chance to reply. I never turned to look at the weeping, crumpled figure behind me. Step by deliberate step, I descended the velvet stairs at the edge of the stage, the cane marking each one against the marble. I made my way up the center aisle of that grand ballroom, and out, leaving her alone beneath the hard glare of the spotlight, exposed in the full ruin of what she had made of herself. 6 months have passed since the Hotel Granduca Houston ballroom became the burial ground for everything I once called family. These days I occupy a small wrought iron chair at a sidewalk cafe in downtown Houston, nothing urgent pressing on me. Clean morning air surrounds me, still holding a trace of last night's rain. Sunlight is working its way across the city skyline, drawing warm shadows long over the pavement. I have on a comfortable linen blazer and a simple flat cap. The sharp suits can stay in the closet now. There is no longer any need to armor myself in an image of commanding authority. I'm an old man having his coffee in the open air, entirely unremarkable to the crowds moving past. Just across the street, the Legacy Block stands that precise $30 million stretch of commercial real estate my wife and son-in-law tried to steal by erasing my mind. Where Gavin's cold glass condominiums were meant to climb skyward, something altogether different is rising instead. The whole parcel has become a roaring active construction zone. Crews in bright yellow vests move across the site, running heavy equipment, driving steel and concrete into the ground for a foundation built to last. Long banners hang from the chain-link fencing, running the full perimeter of the block. Their message is printed large and without apology, the Whitfield Community Empowerment Center. This will not be a retreat for the already comfortable. What is going up on that ground is a full-scale modern facility built to deliver free legal services, financial education and seed funding to young black entrepreneurs right here in Houston. A space where young people from the hard neighborhoods that shaped me can come and be handed real tools for building wealth that survives generations. The Whitfield Family Irrevocable Trust owns it outright and keeps it protected. Ruben, my sharpest ally and the friend I've trusted longest, is running the project from the ground up. I sit here and watch my real inheritance take form, a living monument to something that endures stacked on the very ground where their greed collapsed. From the cafe table, I pick up this morning's newspaper. The verdicts I already knew, but seeing them fixed in print, cold and permanent, closes something inside me. The federal proceedings didn't drag on. When prosecutors walk into court, carrying high-definition footage of cash changing hands with a corrupt physician and audio that captures a conspiracy to poison a husband, there isn't much runway left for the defense. Gavin Colbert, the self-appointed visionary of real estate, who never doubted he was the cleverest person in any room, was handed a 25-year sentence in a maximum security federal facility. The financial task force gutted his Ponzi operation down to the bone. Before the conviction order was even signed, his shadow creditors had already scavenged what little remained of his personal holdings. The paper reported that he wept openly when the federal judge banged the gavel. He came apart like a frightened child at the sentencing, pleading for mercy he had never extended to a single soul in his career. The court gave him none. By the time he walks out of that cell, he will be elderly, diminished, and entirely forgotten. Paulette Whitfield, the woman who occupied my home, my bed in my days for 45 years, drew a 15-year federal sentence. The judge was unmoved by her history of country club affiliations, her charity luncheon resume, or the price tags on her shoes. The conviction was for accessory to attempted murder and federal document forgery, both charges severe. She exchanged her sequined evening gowns for a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit. The remaining years of her life will unfold inside a stark, cold room, every shred of the elite social standing she would have killed to protect now permanently out of reach. Reading her name in that newspaper, I felt nothing at all. The woman I had once loved ceased to exist long before her hand ever closed around that vial of poison. And then there is my daughter, Alicia. Criminal charges never touched her. The federal investigators determined she had no knowledge of the holoperidol drops being added to my coffee. But avoiding a cell didn't mean she avoided what she'd earned. The financial wreckage Gavin left in his wake swallowed her whole. The bank moved immediately on the mansion. Her imported luxury vehicles were repossessed. Every account she held was frozen, and creditors stripped away whatever assets remained. She came out the other side with nothing worse than nothing, actually drowning under a pile of secondary debts Gavin had quietly tied to her name during his frantic final months. Word reached me through Ruben that she's been living in a cramped, run-down little apartment somewhere on the far south side of the city. The socialite circles she'd spent years fighting to belong to dropped her without a backward glance. She's pulling double shifts now at some greasy fast food diner, scrubbing floors and working the grill to keep up with the minimum payments on what she owes. She was the one who looked me in the eye and told me I was blocking her path to a brilliant future. She chose the mirage of a wealthy life over the man who had raised her from nothing. And now the real world has introduced itself in all its pitiless, unembellished truth. I don't wire her money. I don't pick up the phone. That connection is severed permanently and without reservation. A young waitress steps out of the cafe, pulling me back into the present. She comes to my table with an easy, unforced smile and sets a steaming porcelain mug of coffee down before me. She asks whether there's anything else I need. I tell her, no thank you, and she returns inside, leaving me to my thoughts and the view of the construction site across the street. I look at the dark rising steam curling off the porcelain mug. There is nothing lurking beneath that surface. No slow-acting fog waiting to cloud my mind. No chemical prison dissolving into the liquid. I wrap both hands around it. They are completely still. The tremors that racked me for weeks have been fully flushed out, driven off by time and a proper medical detox. I lift the mug and take a long, unhurried sip. Pure black coffee. Nothing added to soften it, nothing slipped in to serve someone else's purpose. No false warmth, no hidden agenda. It's sharp, almost punishing biting at the back of my throat on the way down. But that bite is the flavor of things as they actually are. And for the first time in longer than I can easily recall, the truth is something I can breathe inside of. The sun was hanging low in the sky, throwing amber light across the quiet, well-kept grounds of Forest Park Lawndale Cemetery. I moved at my own pace along the winding stone path, the steady rhythm of my solid mahogany walking cane anchoring me in the stillness. Far removed from the city's noise and the growl of heavy equipment at the new Empowerment Center site, this was where I needed to be. I came to a stop before a plain, weathered granite headstone. No famous name, no monument to power or money. Just my father, a man who worked 2 grueling jobs, his whole life greasework so deep into his hands it never fully washed out. Standing there looking at the letters cut into the stone, I felt something settle in my chest. A quiet, genuine peace. It was my father who bought the very first small parcel of land in downtown Houston more than 50 years ago. A derelict brick garage sitting forgotten on a street corner, to everyone else, nothing. To him, it was proof. Proof that a black man in the South could plant a flag in the earth and call it his. When he died, he left that garage to me. I took everything he'd poured into it, his sweat, his sacrifice, his conviction, and I spent the decades that followed acquiring the surrounding lots one at a time until that modest garage had grown into the $30 million legacy block. I raised an empire on the exact foundation he built with his bare hands. Standing over his grave in the evening quiet, I talked to him. I told him the land was safe. I told him what he'd started would endure. But I also laid down the weight of it. I told him how heavy it had been to carry. I told him the truth I'd learned, that the real predators were never the corporate sharks circling the block or the aggressive bankers making offers. The most dangerous ones were already inside the house, seated around my own dinner table, fed by the same pantry, sleeping under the same roof I paid for. I told my father what it cost me to watch the woman I'd spent 45 years loving sit in that room and methodically plot the destruction of my own mind. I told him what it did to me, to understand that my daughter had been so thoroughly seduced by a counterfeit version of wealth that she was willing to bargain away her father's sanity for a prestigious zip code. There is something that cuts differently when you come to understand that the people you would step in front of a bullet for are the very ones who've been quietly chambering the round. For a long time, I believed my duty as a husband, as a father, was to provide, to shield, and to absorb whatever came at me from the people I loved. But watching them count those drops into my cup, like it was nothing I understood, that endurance without limits isn't strength. Sometimes it's just a slow way of consenting to your own destruction. I told them I hadn't let them do it. I hadn't allowed a reckless, self-important fraud like Gavin to convert everything we'd built into collateral for a con. I took the axe to the rotting limbs of my own family tree because the roots were worth saving. I am 70 years old now. The common wisdom says that at 70, most of the book has been written, that you step to the side, dim yourself down, and let the younger world pass around you surrounded by children and grandchildren. I have no wife. I have no daughter who calls. I am moving into the final stretch of my life without either of them beside me. But standing in that quiet cemetery drawing in the cool autumn air, I understood something. Clearly, being alone and being empty are not the same thing. My solitude belongs entirely to me. That is its own form of freedom. No one is using me as a piece in their game anymore. No one is waiting for the right moment to move me off the board. I am not a bank account with a pulse. I am not a man marked for removal. I am someone who was handed a lethal betrayal, looked it full in the face, and walked through it without losing himself. And my legacy is no longer a matter of property lines and square footage. It lives in that community center climbing upward from the ruins of my son-in-law's collapsed empire. It lives in the young entrepreneurs who will one day build their futures on the very ground my father scratched and clawed to claim as his own. I pressed my palm flat against the cool granite of his headstone and held it there for a long moment. I made him a promise I would keep going, eyes open, mind clear and uncompromised. Then I turned and made my way back along the stone path to my car. If you have stayed with me until the very end of this story, then you already understand what it cost to get here. I want to take a moment and speak plainly. I lost a wife of 45 years. I lost a daughter I raised with everything I had. I walked through a season of my life so dark that I genuinely could not trust the coffee in my own kitchen. And yet, I believe God does not allow a man to be stripped down to nothing without a reason. Sometimes the clearing out is exactly what makes room for the legacy you were actually meant to leave behind. That is what this family revenge story taught me at 70 years old, that your most important chapter may still be ahead of you, no matter what has been taken. Here is what I would tell any adults 50 plus who recognizes any part of this story as their own. First, document everything and trust your instincts early. If something feels wrong inside your own home, do not talk yourself out of it. Second, protect what you have built before a crisis arrives. An irrevocable trust is not a legal luxury. It is a shield. Third, the people who stand to inherit your life's work are not automatically your allies. Love them, but watch who benefits from your confusion. Fourth, solitude is not the same as defeat. Walking away from what is poisoning you, even when it carries a name you love, can be the most dignified decision you ever make. If this story moved you, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not yet subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, this would be a fine moment to do that. Leave me a comment below. Tell me what stayed with you, what hit hardest, or what you would have done differently. I read them, and they matter to me more than I can say. Thank you for being here. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep your eyes open.